You step into a Rome that doesn't yet own a law book, only a memory palace. Rules live in elders' mouths, in priests' closets, in gestures everyone just knows. If you want to buy a field, you don't cite a statute, you recite a ceremony. If a neighbor's ox wanders through your cabbages, you don't pull out a code, you pull in a mediator who quotes your grandfather back at you. This is mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, unwritten, flexible, and conveniently for those in charge, unevenly distributed. Knowledge is a gate. The patricians keep the key. Mainstream pegged to fix early on. Before Rome had statutes, it had religious legal ritual. Many court transactions ran through sacred-seeming forms. The copper and scales mancipatio for transferring important things, land, slaves, beasts of burden, oath-studded promises, and court pleadings that had to be spoken just so. Priests, pontifices, guarded calendars and formulas. Missing a syllable could sink a case the way a missing nail could sink a cart. Law, at first, is a choreography. Misstep and you lose. Now drop into the 5th century BCE and feel pressure building from below. Plebeians, tired of legal Latin being a private dialect, want rules they can read, not rumors they must rent. The famous succession to the Sacred Mount isn't only about debt and dignity, it's about visibility. If justice is a stage, the people want the script. Out of this agitation comes the constitutional theater of the Decemberi Legibus Scribundis, 10 men tasked with writing Rome's first code. Their product, after 2 seasons, if we trust tradition, is the 12 tables, bronze slabs hung in the forum that turn living custom into portable text. Historians still argue whether the code truly chiseled into bronze or was simply published on wooden boards and later remembered as bronze because that feels nobler. They also debate how much Greek influence came along with the supposed embassy to Athens. Did Rome borrow Solon's clarity, or only the idea that writing law tames elites? The fragments ring with native sound, but a few Greek notes sneak in, enough to keep footnotes busy. What did the tables do? Not everything, enough. They didn't invent law from scratch, they curated. They fixed civil procedure, legis actions, and public phrases, how to summon a defendant, an ius vocatio, how to seize a no-show, manus inextio, how to divide a disputed object with a symbolic rod, vindicta. They mapped family power, the father's potestas, guardianship over women, inheritance lines that insisted the agnates, malekin through males, get first bite. They set property and delict outlines, how to establish boundaries, what to do with a fallen tree, how to assess damages for a broken bone, how to punish theft by night versus theft by day. They even scheduled the courts by cleaning up the calendar. No more sneaky, religious, blackout days that only pontiffs remembered. Quirky tidbit, Roman schoolchildren for centuries memorized the 12 tables by heart, like a singable civic creed. Later authors groan about the style, spare, archaic, sometimes brutal, but praise the effect, a common grammar of justice. Somewhere in the Suburra you can almost hear a chorus of 8-year-olds chanting clauses about debt, as if multiplication tables and legal tables were cousins. The code's texture alternates between stern poetry and housekeeping. One clause permits talio, an eye for an eye, yet in practice Rome prefers composition, money, over mutilation. Another outlaws burial or cremation within city limits, public health, meet piety. There are fire rules. If your thatch catches, your neighbor's ladder had better be nearby. And marriage rules. A year of unbroken cohabitation creates a husband's hand, unless the wife spends 3 nights away. The famous trinoxium, a calendar hack women used with gusto. There is debt law with a chill. 30 days to pay, then seizure, then grim options. And there is the seed of reform. Because nothing makes a city inventive like citizens in chains. Light joke 1. A harried farmer asks where to find the law. A pontiff points to his own head and says, "Right here." The farmer replies, Then open hours would be appreciated. Light joke 2. A litigant mispronounces a ritual word and loses. He vows to sue the alphabet. The alphabet refuses jurisdiction. Light joke 3. A boy memorizing the tables promises he will never forget them. 30 years later he becomes a praetor and insists they were his idea. The tables also democratize time. By publishing the calendar of court days, they pry open a priestly monopoly. Knowing when to sue becomes as accessible as knowing how. Law begins to detach from religion without divorcing it. The pontiffs still consult, but magistrates gain daylight. In that daylight, politics and procedure start dancing in public. Now watch how written law begins to breed procedure. The early system of legis actions, actions by exact words, fits a world in love with form. Say the formula right, and you enter a two-stage process. First before a magistrate, in year, who frames the issue and appoints a judge. Then before that judge, a pud judice, who hears evidence and counts beans into damages. The 12 tables anchor those formulas. But rigid words can strangle hard cases, and Rome, a city allergic to knots, starts loosening ties. This will be section 6 story, how formulas get replaced by tailored writs. But the seed is here. Write law once, interpret it forever. Dead is where you most feel both the code's grit and subsequent mercy. The tables tolerate nexum, debt bondage tied by ritual copper, and the terrifying edictio of a defaulting debtor to creditors. Tradition then tells a reformed tale. Outrage at abuses, whether real or painted vividly, produces the Lex Poetelia Papiria in the 4th century BC, softening or abolishing personal bondage for debt in favor of property liability. Historians still argue whether the reform was one law or many, one date or several, lightning or drizzle. The moral is clearer than the chronology. Rome learns to prefer purses over bodies as collateral, a shift that will make its marketplaces both larger and more livable. The table's criminal notes sound old but practical. Nighttime thief caught in the act? Lethal force is excused. Daytime theft? Shout, seize, sue. Arson? Death by burning in some readings, but more often heavy penalties. Passive voice, active city. Your neighbors prefer fines they can count and examples they can see. The code doesn't build a police force. It equips citizens to mobilize courts without first bribing a memory. Property rules in the tables are archaeology in prose. Boundary stones are sacred. Move them and you invite gods and neighbors in equal fury. Fruit that falls into your field is yours. Fruit you shake from your neighbor's tree with a stick is creative and billable. If your animal wanders, you pay for damage. If someone lures your animal, they pay you for the animal and for the insult. The logic is Roman arithmetic. Reckon loss, assign responsibility, write a clause you can teach to children and goats. A word on style. The 12 tables aren't a constitution. They are a civic user manual. They don't preach equality. They publish expectations. Plebeians get sight of the rules and, over time, leverage that sight into rights. Provocatio, appeal, tribune's sacrosanctity, entry into magistracies, through further statutes and political creativity. The code is a floor, not a ceiling. It gives reformers footing and conservatives furniture to rearrange instead of sacred heirlooms to fight over. Mainstream anchor for the historical toolkit. Our knowledge of the tables is fragmentary, quoted by later authors like Cicero, Gaius, Aulus Gellius, and legal compilers, yet consistent enough to reconstruct themes. No single tablet survives. What endures is a chorus of citations across centuries that treat the code as Rome's secular scripture. The text you hear is partly law, partly legend, perfectly Roman. Historians still argue whether the decemvirate's second year was a true tyranny toppled by a people's righteous anger, enter the story of Virginia, or a later moral play that explains constitutional caution. Either way, Rome digests the episode into a lesson. Right law, yes. Fear concentrated power, also yes. After the Decembers, ordinary magistrates return. Statutes multiply. The code hangs as a baseline while politics writes in the margins. You can feel the legal mind harden from custom to concept. Where Mos Maiorum said, "We do it this way," the tables say, "Do it this way." And the later jurists will ask, "Why this way?" That sequence, habit, order, reason, becomes Rome's signature. In a century or two, praetors will innovate remedies by annual edict, jurists will gloss principles into doctrine, and emperors will collate it all. But the bump from fog to letters, from priestly calendar to public schedule, from ritual whispers to posted rules, that is the civic Big Bang. Light joke 4. Because every origin myth deserves a bonus, a goat eats a corner of a newly posted statute. A boy says, "Then fines shall be ruminated." The magistrate glares. The jurist writes a commentary. The goat retires from public life. Before you leave the forum, look up at the imagined slabs and notice their tone. No rhetoric, little mercy, plenty of clarity. They assume neighbors will still need to talk, merchants will still haggle, families will still quarrel, and judges will still be chosen for their eyebrows. They aim not to end disputes, but to standardize how disputes end. That modesty is their genius. Later ages will crown principles, equity, good faith, cause, possession, with philosophical laurel. The tables simply make sure everyone starts the race in the same lane. You walk away with the feeling a city gets when it has taught itself to read its own rules. Above you, magistrates practice announcing court days. In side streets, children drill clauses like nursery rhymes. In a shadowed portico, a priest realizes with a small, private smile that secrecy has lost a little of its price. Rome has written itself onto wood or bronze. The rest of the story is Rome learning to write in margins, and to let creative hands, like the praetors, add pages without tearing out the old ones. You stand at the edge of the forum and watch authority put on its mourning costume. 2 men in white togas with purple borders step down from the curia. 12 lictors go before them, each carrying a bundle of rods with an axe peeking out. The fasces, a portable paragraph that says, "Compel, command, punish." The rods are for coercion. The axe, within the city, is a memory rather than a promise. When the lictors pass a shrine, they lower the fasces. When they pass the people, sometimes they lower them too. That gesture, force bowing to audience, is Rome's favorite contradiction. These are consuls, the yearly executives whose imperium is both military license and civil command. You feel how politics turns into enforceable sentences. Assemblies elect, auspices approve, the Senate advises. But it is the consul who speaks, go, and makes men march. Imperium is not a mood, it's a legal weather system conferred by vote, sanctified by birds, bounded by customs you can point to and break only once. Mainstream pegs to keep your sandals steady. Imperium, domi et militiae, empowers the holder to command armies, convene assemblies, comitia, issue edicts, and enforce order by coercitio, fines, arrest, sometimes corporal penalties. Inside the pomerium, sacred boundary of the city, it is domesticated. No axes in the fasces, appeals, provocatio ad populum, hem and severity, colleagues and tribunes can veto. Outside, the leash lengthens. In the field, the general's word is logistics, law, and sometimes weather. You watch collegiality and annuality do their quiet work. 2 consuls, 1 year. The arrangement is an anti-king architecture. Each consul can act. Each can stop the other with intercessio. The calendar prods them forward. A year is not long. Glory ages fast. Light joke 1, a bystander says, "Rome has 2 heads and therefore 1 headache." A lictor pretends not to smile. The consul's mourning is a symphony of verbs. He convenes a public meeting, Concio, to test a bill's temperature, consults the Senate, whose octoritas is a heavy wind, posts edicts that set the season's procedural tone, and writes to governors whose worries are measured in supply wagons. When he leaves for war, his imperium crosses the pomerium like a dog finally let off the leash. If his campaign outlasts the calendar, the people or Senate prorogue his authority. Proconsul now, a past-year title stretched to future need. Rome solves the problem of short terms with long shadows. But the forum's other star in a slightly smaller orbit is the praetor. Originally 1, a step below consul, then 2, the urbanus for citizen disputes, the peregrinus for cases involving foreigners, then more as the city's appetite for litigation grows. The praetor's imperium is narrower at the tip, more law, less legions, yet his pen quietly rewires the republic. He publishes an edict at the year's start, a menu of remedies he promises to grant. I will give an action if. I will protect possession if. I will restore if. This is the ius et ascendi, the right to edict. Its annual improvisations turn into a tradition, the edictum tralititium, a carried-over baseline that becomes, in practice, a source of law. Mainstream anchor. The praetor's edict system gradually reshaped the rigid old legis actions procedure into the more flexible formula, a written instruction sent to a lay judge, iudex, framing the legal question and the remedy if proved. The praetor doesn't decide the facts, he engineers the lawsuit. He can grant interdicts, summary orders, appoint guardians, approve stipulations, and open doors where statutes left walls. By the late Republic, the law according to the praetor, ius honorarium, sits beside the civil law, ius civil, like a helpful, living commentary. Principles you can feel underfoot, annuality, short terms check ambition, collegiality, pairs check each other, publicity, edicts posted on a whiteboard, album, so litigants can aim, and appeal, provocatio, as a rope thrown from the people to a citizen when a magistrate pulls too hard. At the tribunes of the plebs, sacrosanct officials who can veto a magistrate's act and shelter a person on a threshold, auxilium. They are not judges, but they are brakes, and in Rome brakes are cherished technology. Historians still argue whether provocatio protected citizens everywhere or effectively only domi, inside or near the city. The text suggests an evolving radius. Under some statutes, appeal reaches beyond the pomerium. Generally, soldiers under discipline in camp don't get to shout, "I appeal!" at inconvenient moments. Debate also lingers on the earliest scope of imperium itself. Is it a single ancient concept or a bundle of licenses tidily labeled? The safe sentence is that imperium grew habits the way a river grows banks. Not all magistrates carry axes. Aediles manage markets, streets, and games. Their edicts govern warranties, your slave's health, your mule's soundness, and their festivals persuade the city that law also knows how to dance. Quaestors are the treasury's young elbows, handling the aerarium, paying armies, learning how numbers scold. Censors, elected every 5 years, do the moral and fiscal census. They enroll citizens, revise the Senate list, and scowl at expensive behavior with penalties that make luxury briefly unfashionable. Over them all floats the possibility of a dictator, 6 months of single authority for emergencies, paired with a master of horse. It is the Republic's admission that sometimes you break the glass and press the button. Collegiality pauses. The year shrinks. Urgency hums. You notice coercitio in the streets. A magistrate orders a fine for a seller short on measure. Lictors clear a path for an assembly. A heckler is seized, then released when a tribune raises his hand. Rome choreographs power, rehearses friction. Light joke too. A tribune blocks a consul's speech. The consul thanks him for the dramatic pause. The crowd applauds the comedy. Auspices lace politics with birds. Before assemblies or campaigns, magistrates consult the skies. Bad omens postpone votes. cancel marches, scuttle meetings. Skeptics roll eyes. Even skeptics schedule around omens because religio is also calendar control. The power to watch birds and declare the augury unfavorable, obnunciatio, can kill a bill without a single debate, unless laws like the Lex Clodia de Auspicibus, briefly, clip the practice. Rome knows that sometimes law is a raven on a line. The cursus honorum organizes ambition into a ladder. Minimum ages and sequences, codified by the Lex Villia Annalis, force a pacing, quaestor first, then aedile or tribune, praetor, consul. You don't skip rungs, at least not in polite years. The latter disciplines talent and helps voters predict who is where when. The Senate's octoritas floats between steps, not a law, not a command, but a gravity that pulls magistrates toward consensus or marks them eccentric when they drift. Procedurally, a typical civil case shows the consular, praetorian duet. A litigant summons, in ius vocatio, the other before the praetor. The praetor fashions a formula. If it appears that eos be 10, condemn, if not, absolve, and appoints a iudex, private citizen judge, to hear facts. In dirtier disputes, the praetor issues interdicts. Don't throw the neighbor out of possession until we sort this. Or sets up restitutio in integrum, an equitable rewind for minors, soldiers, or victims of fraud. Criminal prosecutions evolve from ad hoc trials before assemblies to questions perpetui, standing jury courts for extortion, treason, murder, and the like. Praetors preside, jurors judge, brilliant advocates perform theater with evidence. Somewhere, a young Cicero sharpens his verbs. Historians still argue whether a praetor's edict had the force of law on its own or functioned as enforceable policy until contradicted by statute. Practice treated it like law enough to build lives on. They also debate how far Sulla's reforms, and later Caesar's tinkering, centralized criminal justice and constrained tribunes. The pendulum swung with strong men and swung back with memory. The empire will eventually pull most strings into a single hand, cognitio extra ordinem, but for now the republic hums on collegial improvisation. Symbols keep theory honest. The cella curalis, a folding ivory chair, announces a magistrate's right to sit and be obeyed. The toga praetexta, purple-striped, announces dignity even in the dust. The tubicines, trumpeters, announce that assemblies are open, votes are imminent, or that someone misread the sky. You can hear governance, you can see it move. The people's assemblies, comitia centuriata, by centuries, comitia tributa, by tribes, concilium plebis, plebeians only, legislate, elect, and judge in major cases. A consul or praetor convenes, a tribune can halt, a herald reads, a bill is voted. After the Lex Hortensia, 287 BC, plebiscites bind all citizens, not just the plebs. The republic becomes a little less patrician in its vowels. Light joke 3. A farmer at the back shouts he can't hear. The herald shouts that the gods can. The farmer replies the gods don't need to vote. You also watch the jurisdiction map widen. As Rome annexes provinces, governors wield imperium with a governor's edict that mirrors the praetors. Promises about taxes, contracts, and court access for locals and Romans alike. The praetor peregrinus at home develops tools that speak across languages. Bona fides, good faith, informal agreements honored if reliance shows, procedural shortcuts that make trade faster than quibbles. What begins as citizen law becomes an empire's common sense. Ius gentium, and magistrates are the translators. Quirky tidbit. On New Year's Day of a praetor's term, the city buzzed to read the new edict as if it were a season's menu. Litigants wanted to know which flavors of fairness were in fashion. Another, lictors sometimes carried a covering for the fasces. Lowering and uncovering became a mini-ritual of respect, like taking off a hat that could arrest you. By dusk you recognize the choreography. Assemblies grant titles. Auspices bless. The Senate drafts consent. Magistrates pronounce and enforce. Tribunes veto. Jurors judge. Scribes immortalize choices on wax. No single step is law, the dancing is law. A consul's army wins territory. A praetor's edict wins predictability. Both victories keep Rome from tearing its own tents. The genius isn't in the axe or the rod, but in the habit of lowering them at the right moments and in the right places, so that citizens can breathe between commands. Before the lamps are lit, the consuls return past the rostra, the lictors a little dusty, the fasces respectful. You can see how a year will leave dents in their togas and lines in their foreheads. You can also see the structure that will replace them when their year runs out. Tomorrow a tribune will threaten a veto, a praetor will draft a smarter formula, the Senate will change a verb, and the crowd will decide whether to applaud. In Rome, imperium is not a person, it is a conversation with grammar, urgent, annual, and on good days, intelligible. You arrive at the Forum on New Year's morning and discover that Rome releases patch notes. A young scribe climbs a ladder, unrolls a fresh, white board, the album, and begins painting lines from the praetor's new edict. People crane next the way markets crane prices. Advocates angle for a better view, debtors rehearse hope, creditors rehearse dignity, and you, who like your law to arrive with bullet points, feel a peculiar calm. This is the Republic's software update. The praetor doesn't make laws, in the assembly's sense. He publishes promises. I will grant this action. I will grant that interdict. I will appoint a judge if you plead thus. It is advertising with teeth. The city reads, adapts, lives inside the year-long miniature constitution that follows this man around like a polite thundercloud. If the ius civil, the civil law of citizens, is the skeleton, the edict is the connective tissue that lets Rome bend without snapping, mainstream anchor to keep our sandals from slipping. By the late Republic, the praetor urbanus, for citizen cases, and the praetor peregrinus, for disputes involving foreigners, publish edicts at the start of their terms. Over time, carried over, cor, the edictum tralititium, emerges, conserving tried and true remedies. Innovations sit at the edges. Jurists later called the praetor's contribution ius honorarium, law of the magistrates. To aid, supplement, or correct the civil law. The edict doesn't annul statutes. It routes around their gaps and softens their corners. You watch how the edict translates into choreography. A litigant leads his opponent before the praetor, in ius vocatio. The praetor consults the album like a chef checks a menu and drafts a formula, a neat, conditional instruction to a lay judge iudex. If it appears that A ought to pay B10, condemn, if not, absolve. Sometimes there's a penalty intentio, claim, sometimes a clever exception, exceptio, sometimes an arbitrium boni viri. What a good man would judge! An equity valve disguised as good manners. The judge receives a discreet rectangle of bark or wax with the script and the authority to turn facts into money. You feel the state stepping aside just enough to let citizens adjudicate each other with a referee, not a ruler. The edict's tool belt glitters with interdicts, summary, barked orders for urgent messes. UTI Possididis protects current possession of land pending trial. Utrubi protects possession of movables. Unday 6 restores someone violently ousted. De 6 Armada takes a darker tone when armed force is involved. There's an interdictum de hominibus liberis exhibendis. Bring forth the free person, used to smoke out someone wrongfully held. Procedure here is mercy made fast. Don't solve the whole case, stop the bleeding. Light joke 1. An advocate quips that interdicts are like bandages, applied quickly, removed slowly, and occasionally reused for savings. The praetor pretends not to hear the last clause. You linger at the bonorum possessio, the praetor's inheritance fix. Statutes favored stiff agnatic lines. Life favored closer loves. The praetor grants possession of an estate to cognates, blood relatives through women, to emancipated children, to a disinherited daughter with a sympathetic city behind her. He doesn't rewrite the ius civil. He privileges a claimant who can then defend possession. Over generations, these Praetorian preferences turn into new normals. By the classical age, a Roman heir consults both the civil order and the Praetorian order like two maps that finally agree on most roads. Contracts benefit from the edict's love of reliance. The old civil law adored the formal stipulatio, call and response promises and prescribed words. Commerce, however, runs on handshakes and letters. The praetor invents actions for good faith, boni fidei, dealings, emptio venditio, sale, locatio conductio, hire/lease, societas, partnership, mandatum, agency, where the judge can weigh fairness, implied terms, and custom. Suddenly a buyer can recover for hidden defects. A lessee can claim relief for uninhabitable rooms. A partner can demand accounts without reciting a poem in copper. Equity moves in, carrying boxes labeled reasonableness. Light joke 2. A seller insists the mule is energetic. The praetor's action translates that as kicks. The judge translates it as refund. Delicts, private wrongs, gain calibration. The edict shapes actions for furtum, theft, inuria, insult/injury, and damnum inuria datum, wrongful damage, later formalized by the lex Aquilia. A thief may owe a multiple of the value, an insulter a sum that teaches silence, a careless neighbor the price of your crushed vines plus a moral surcharge measured in eyebrows. The praetor doesn't invent outrage, he prices it. He also curates defenses, exceptio doli, fraud, metus, duress, pactum conventum, a later agreement, so that wooden law doesn't reward clever wolves. Possession, the quiet star, gets its own weather. Owning and holding aren't the same. The praetor protects the holder even when title is cloudy, because stability matters while truth is fetched. Interdicts keep current hands on goods until a proper action decides ownership. Add time and bona fides and you get ius capio, acquisition by long, non-nefarious possession, a civil rule the praetor harmonizes with exceptions for stolen things, dowry property, and items withheld by bad faith. Commerce hates suspense. The edict shortens it to a human scale. Historians still argue whether the edict had law force or policy force. Did the praetor bind judges because the edict was, functionally, legislation, or because no sensible judge wants to quarrel with the person who appoints him? The later Edictum Perpetuum under Hadrian, standardized by jurist Salvius Julianus, suggests the edict's living core had become canon. But in your Republican morning the debate smells like wet paint. Annual freshness versus cumulative custom, innovation versus continuity. The safe answer: the edict behaved like law because everyone behaved as if it were. Now the Peregrinus praetor, Rome's cosmopolitan notary, steps forward. Foreign merchants don't bring legis actions in their luggage, they bring habit. The edict responds with bona fides across languages, enforcing informal agreements if performance, partial payment, or usage shows a deal. From these practical patches grows the famous distinction between ius civil, citizen law, and ius gentium, law of peoples, not international law, in our sense, but a trans-tribal grammar of fairness. The engine hums, add a remedy, induce behavior, watch custom ossify into doctrine, quirky tidbit, advocates kept private, edicts passed, notebooks, greatest hits of clever clauses and beloved exceptions, to predict which praetors would copy which lines. Seasoned lawyers courted ambitious praetors and suggested small improvements. The city joked that some edicts were written in the forum's back rooms with wine, which is also where most improvements in human history are made. The edict's mercy can also rewind time, restitutio in integrum, restoration to the previous state, is the praetor's emergency brake. Miners duped into selling land, soldiers away at war missing deadlines, victims of fraud who signed under pressure, the praetor can, for equity, undo a transaction and tell formal law to sit down. It's used sparingly and explained sternly, but its existence warms rooms. Light joke 3. A trickster complains that restitutio ruins business. The praetor replies that business should survive honesty. You follow one case from summons to sentence. A widow sues to recover a dowry farm her late husband's heir refuses to return. The praetor cites his edict. He'll grant an action for dowry recovery with a fast track, allow deductions narrowly, and let the widow secure the land pending trial with an interdict. He drafts a formula that builds in an "if the defendant acted in bad faith" clause to raise damages. A judge is appointed from the list, respectable, solvent, able to count. Witnesses speak, account tablets whisper. The judge condemns and the farm walks home in the form of a court officer and a polite mob. You can feel Section 5 smiling. Procedure itself shifts under the edict. The old legious actions demanded ritual words. The edict's formulas demand intelligible claims. The condictio actions, generic claims for sums or things, standardized debt litigation. The actio publiciana fiction treats a good faith possessor as if he had completed jus capio, letting him win against later grabbers. The praetor uses, as if, with surgical grace, inventing fictions to serve facts. This isn't cheating, it's Rome admitting that justice sometimes needs subjunctive mood. Mainstream aside, compact as a seal, Gaius sketches the procedural evolution. Cicero's speeches show the edict at work. Ulpian and Paul, later excerpted in Justinian's Digest, analyze interdicts, boni fidei actions, and restitutio. Hadrian's standardization freezes the edict's mature shape, but in your century its liveliness is the point. Each praetor sings the anthem with a riff. Historians still argue whether Sulla's criminal court reforms shackled the praetor's creativity, or merely redirected it towards civil justice. They also debate how much popular pressure, merchants, freedmen, foreigners, drove edictal change versus top-down juristic engineering. Evidence points to a duet. Life proposes, praetors and jurists compose. Litigants hum along. By dust the album shines with drying black letters. Advocates have already started rehearsing citations that will sound like care. The edict has promised help where statutes left people cold, and in doing so it has taught a habit. If a rule pinches, ask for a remedy. If a case wanders, draw a line. If a form lies, draft a fiction that tells the truth. Tomorrow a different man might wear the purple stripe, but he will inherit the songbook. That is how Rome keeps novelty from feeling like treason. You walk away knowing that the praetor's edict is less a speech than a scaffold. It holds the city's disputes safely above chaos for 12 months, then hands them to the next scaffold, a little higher, a little neater. Statutes may be Rome's bones. The edict is its joints. Jurists will be its muscles soon enough. For tonight the board gleams, the ink dries, and the forum murmurs with the rare civic pleasure of being able to point at the exact place where fairness will stand tomorrow. You linger by the praetor's fresh album and notice something quietly radical. Not everyone queuing speaks Latin with the same hometown vowels, and yet the clerk doesn't shoo them away. Rome has two legal dialects that hold hands in public. Ius Civil, the city's native grammar written for citizens, and Ius Gentium, the pragmatic Esperanto of empire that lets a Syrian shipowner, a Gallic cattle trader, and a Roman banker make promises without first exchanging genealogies. You will spend the next hour watching these two tongues arrange a wedding between principle and practicality. The Ius Civil feels like your oldest tunic, cut to citizen measures, hemmed by statutes, priestly formulas, and jurist's gloss. It governs quirks only Romans adore, agnatio and family inheritance, mancipatio with copper and scales, the scenic routes of aggregatio and adoptio, and the solemn nods to ancestral mores that insist certain transfers and marriages use the city's own choreography. It is proud, particular, sometimes fussy, and very good at telling you exactly where to stand when you say, "I do," to land or people. But then watch a merchant from Rhodes slide a wax tablet across a counter to a freedman from Capua. No emancipatio, no priest, no genealogy, just a price, a measure, delivery tomorrow, and a handshake whose muscles have crossed more seas than prayers. Enter ius gentium, the law of the peoples, which is less a statute book and more a kit of sensible tools Romans think any sane community would recognize. Keep your bargains, don't steal, pay for damage you cause, don't lie to partners, return deposits, behave as if tomorrow exists. It isn't international law in our modern sense, it's a shared commercial grammar that the Praetor Peregrinus carries like a translator's bag. Mainstream fact, crisp enough to inscribe on a tablet. Gaius opens his institutes by dividing law into ius civil, peculiar to a city, ius gentium, common to all peoples, and ius naturale, what nature teaches all animals. The courtroom you're eavesdropping on runs mostly on the first two. The Praetor Urbanus keeps citizen quarrels orderly with formulas and interdicts. The Praetor Peregrinus, and governors and provinces, enforce good faith dealings for anyone with a purse and a pulse. Between them, a cosmopolitan market learns to breathe. You can feel the difference most in contracts. The civil law's darling is stipulatio, a formal Q&A promise. Do you promise to pay 10? I promise. That turns air into an enforceable line of Latin. Ius gentium smiles and admits that the world does business in letters, nods, samples, deposits, and partial deliveries. So the praetor's edict blesses boni fidei actions, emptio venditio, sale, locatio conductio, hire/lease, societas, partnership, mandatum, agency. Judges in these suits can look at custom, fairness, hidden defects, implied terms, the soft furniture of trade. A buyer of amphorae filled with what turns out to be enthusiastic river water gets a refund. A tenant in a flat where the ceiling practices gravity gets an abatement. Light joke 1. The landlord says the fallen plaster is decorative. The judge says the decoration can live in damages. Status law shows the limit line. Ius civil is picky about citizenship. Who can make a Roman will? Who can marry in connubium? Who can vote under which tribe? Who can hold magistracy without thunderclouds? Ius gentium doesn't hand out togas. It hands out remedies. If a peregrine deposits money with you, you owe it back. If you hire his mule, you return it unexciting. If you ship his grain and lose it between two suspiciously festive ports, you pay. Commerce insists that strangers be legible even when their names baffle your doorkeeper. Historians still argue whether ius gentium was Rome's discovery of natural law, wearing a business hat, or simply a convenience category for cosmopolitan practice that jurists later dressed in Stoic vocabulary. Gaius keeps ius naturale in a separate, airy room. Later jurists blur the edges. Modern scholars debate with appetite. The safe sentence, Roman lawyers found in ius gentium a persuasive middle, less parochial than ius civil, more practical than philosophy. Family law illustrates the two speeds. Under ius civil, marriage in full archaic dress, conferiatio, coemptio, usus, had sharp consequences for property and priesthood, citizen machinery with citizen outputs. Yet across the empire, couples formed unions that lacked Roman solemnities but looked like marriages. The Praetor Peregrinus could protect such unions' property expectations and children standing under good faith suits, even when strict connubium rules were not met. A provincial father might not make a Roman testamentum per aes et libram, but a governor's edict would still let him pass a flock and a workshop to the daughter who actually ran both. Quirky tidbit. Bilingual contracts from the Greek East sometimes pair a terse Latin stipulatio with a Greek narrative clause spelling the real deal: quantity of purple dye, quality of timber, delivery. Before the west wind changes its mind. A judge reads both like a duet. The Latin binds, the Greek explains. The remedy arrives in a currency everyone respects, coin, or occasionally amphory, which are coin that slosh. Property and possession also shake hands across the border. Ius civil cherishes quiritarian ownership, the full, formal title recognized in the oldest courtrooms, while ius gentium and the praetor protect possession for day-to-day peace. A peregrine who has long held a shop bona fide can sue and be sued about it. A Roman who bought stolen goods without knowing can sometimes keep them after time via usucapio, unless the item is notorious. Dowry property, sacred things, items seized in war from Romans. The Edicts Actio Publiciana even lets a good faith possessor pretend the clock has finished running. Light joke 2. A shopkeeper claims his table, usucapted, itself because it's been in the same spot 12 years. The judge says furniture doesn't run clocks, clerks do. Beyond the walls, provincial governance braids the two laws into a practical rope. Governors circulate with an edict, part travel diary, part promise sheet, that announces taxes, court access, and contract rules for locals and Romans alike. Local laws and customs remain, so long as they don't collide with Rome's steel beams. Pay tribute, don't rebel, don't invent gods that forbid harvests or oaths. A Phoenician city keeps its council and waits. A Jewish community keeps marriage norms. A Greek town arbitrates by inscription and memory, and the governor nods unless someone smuggles arson into a dowry clause. Ius civil claims ultimate sovereignty. Ius gentium keeps the bazaar open. You notice fides, trust, blooming as a shared virtue. Merchants seal jars with pitch and sign rope knots that carry personal marks. Bankers count with a rhythm that says, "This is theater, but honest theater." The praetor peregrinus relies on that fides when he enforces letters of credit and shipments that won't arrive for months. A shipper's reputation becomes a form of collateral you can hear in the market when his name is spoken with a tone part prayer, part invoice. Historians still argue whether Roman courts respected local sacred oaths as seriously as their own. Did swearing by Isis or Zeus in a provincial forum carry the same weight as swearing by Jupiter in Rome? Evidence points to a generous practice. Truth is costly under any god who watches receipts. Governors preferred perjury in a language they didn't speak to riots they would have to. The archive shrugs and shows fines. War creates its own vocabulary in ius gentium. Prisoners, truces, ambassadors, ransom. Rome treats envoys as inviolable, mostly, punishes perfidy, ideally, and distinguishes between bellum iustum, just war, and whatever actually happened last summer in the hills. Spoils become the state's before they become anyone's. Treaties, fodera, are engraved and stored near gods who dislike erasures. The officiales, priestly envoys, once threw spears over borders with legal solemnity. Later generals throw declarations into a senate that prefers accounting to spears. Light joke 3. Official complains that no one lets him throw spears anymore. A clerk offers him a pen and says, "This travels farther." The civil law occasionally borrows the gentium's better manners. When legious actions choke, the edicts formally breathe. When rigid inheritance leaves daughters poor in love but rich in law, the praetor's bonorum possessio steps in. When debt rules threaten bodies, practice slides toward property. Over time, jurists begin to explain these harmonies out loud. Ius civil is strictum ius strict. Ius honorarium / gentium is equity's interpreter. Together they aim at what later writers dare to call equitas, fairness that can be predicted. Mainstream anchor to steady the close. By the High Empire, Hadrian standardizes the Praetorian Edict, Edictum Perpetuum, preserving its ius gentium tools. Gaius, Ulpian, and Paul teach students to move between citizen law and the common law of peoples as if switching tunics. The later Justinianic compilers will keep the distinction as pedagogy even after procedure changes. Medieval glossators will debate its metaphysics. Modern civil codes will beam with recognition when they meet good faith in their own mirrors. Historians still argue whether Rome truly believed in a universal law discoverable by reason, Stoic style, or whether jurists just liked tidy categories and customers from Antioch. The arguments are enjoyable because they do not change how bread was bought or ships were insured. Practice is the oracle here, and practice says this: when strangers trade under predictability, empires relax. By dusk you think of ius civil as the city's backbone, and ius gentium as its extended hand. One keeps titles clean, families legible, rituals comfortingly exact. The other keeps markets honest, strangers protected, schedules believable. You watch a citizen sue a citizen over a boundary stone with strict ius, while 3 paces away a Cilician and a Roman settle a die contract under bona fides. Both leave with remedies and only mild resentment, which, in Rome, counts as peace. You walk away past a money changer who tests coins on his teeth, the oldest laboratory of the peoples, past the scribe copying a bilingual deed without smirking, past the governor's courier pinning tomorrow's court hours, dies legitimi, where anyone can see. 2 legal dialects, 1 shared habit, post the rules where people can read them, then keep your word. The rest is accent. You stand before the praetor's bench and notice something upside down in a way that makes procedural sense. Rome doesn't hand you a shiny box labeled rights. It hands you a doorway labeled actio and says gently, if you can fit your grievance through this, a judge will meet you on the other side. Justice here is not an abstract entitlement, it's a toolkit of lawsuits. You don't own a right. You own a way to sue.so. You rehearse the choreography you've been learning since those 12 tables lessons. Step 1. Summon. And I use vocatio, with enough politeness to keep the praetor from yawning and enough firmness to keep the defendant from vanishing behind a fig stall. Step 2. Frame. Stand before the magistrate and request the appropriate actio from the edict's menu. Step 3. The praetor forges a formula, a compact. If then, script for a lay judge iudex. Step 4. Step away from marble into an ordinary room where that judge hears witnesses, peers at tablets, and turns, if proved, into pay. No rights were harmed in the making of this remedy. All the action lives in, well, actions. Mainstream fact to steady your sandals. Gaius, the calm schoolteacher of the 2nd century, opens his procedural book by listing actions as the instruments by which we pursue our jura, and then spends far more ink on actions than on jura themselves. The Republic and early Empire are lawsuit cultures. To have the ius without the actio is like possessing a key-shaped cloud. The praetor's edict, polished in Section 3, is basically a catalog of action-based promises. You start playing spot the genre. There are actions in rem, against the thing, like a property vindication, re vindicatio. This farm is mine, make him stop pretending otherwise. If you win, the thing comes home or its value does. Then there are actions in personam, against a person, like the basic condictio for a sum certain. He promised 10, he did not, let the arithmetic talk. The first sounds like a map dispute, the second like math class with eyebrows. Both end in the same coin, but the path teaches you what Rome values: clarity of claim, clarity of proof, clarity of payment. The flavor shifts with the agreement. For strict deals, strict juries, the judge follows the formula's arithmetic like a drumline. For good faith contracts, boni fidei, the judge can weigh customs, implied duties, and that very Roman smell test called reasonableness. So your sale of amphory, good faith, lets you talk hidden defects and fair price, your naked stipulatio. Do you promise 10? I promise. Keeps the conversation short and audible. Light joke 1. An overtalkative seller tries to explain why sour wine is philosophical. The judge says he prefers his metaphysics without vinegar. Delicts, private wrongs, arrive not as moral sermons but as tailored actions with multipliers. Furtum, theft, offers the actio furti, twice the value if discovered later, fourfold if caught in the act. Injuria, insult/assault, gives you a dignitary price tag the judge adjusts with taste. Damnum injuria datum, wrongful damage under the lex aquilia, gives a neat highest value in the last year. Measure for your vine-destroying neighbor. The praetor adds modern-seeming defenses. Exceptio doli, fraud, metus, duress, pactum, we change the deal, and your lawsuit becomes less a hammer and more a toolkit with surprising screwdrivers. Procedure is half theater, half engineering. In the inure stage, you and your opponent grasp a symbolic rod, vindicta, over a disputed item or recite the claim in terms the edict understands. The praetor slices the problem into a formula with an intentio, what you allege, a condemnatio, what the judge must do if convinced, and sometimes a demonstratio, which transaction we're talking about. In the apud judicem stage, you move to a less ceremonial room with a single judge or a panel. There, truth is fetched by witnesses, documents, and the occasional expert who can tell good olive oil from optimism. Timing matters. Many actions expire with a calendar's sigh. Annual claims for certain delicts, shorter windows for interdicts, longer for property. Miss the window and even the best grievance turns into an excellent story with no remedy. Hence the praetor's merciful emergency brake, restitutio in integrum, for minors, soldiers, or the egregiously duped, which can rewind a deadline when equity blushes at the strict rule. Light joke 2. A crafty debtor claims he missed court because of omens. The praetor says the only omen that matters is the hourglass on his table. The menu's breadth is its genius. You've got possessory interdicts to pause brawls over land, actio publiciana to treat a good faith possessor as if time had already perfected his title, actio de peculio to reach a father or master's purse for contracts made by a son or slave with a granted fund, actio instatoria to tag a merchant's principal when his shopman makes a deal at the counter, actio de dolo to unmask clever harm, actio quod metus causa to unspool agreements signed with a metaphorical dagger present. Each one is a narrow bridge over a swamp you would rather not wade. Quirky tidbit. Some actions could be transformed by a juris fiction, your advocate whispers. Let's pretend the condition has happened. Or, as if the year had elapsed. And the praetor, fond of honesty served with imagination, nods. These fictions are Rome legalizing what everyone already believes is fair. It turns out the law's subjunctive mood is extremely practical. Because actions are the oxygen, advocacy becomes cartography. A good lawyer doesn't yell about rights. He selects the precise actio, adds or parries exceptions, and arranges a replicatio to neutralize the defense he knows is coming. The pleadings read like chess: claim, exception, reply, counter-reply, each one a layer of conditional grammar baked into the formula like pastry. You watch a sale case sprout an exceptio pacti, we renegotiated, a replicatio, yes, but under duress, and a duplicatio, actually, we later affirmed. Somewhere Cicero smiles, somewhere a scribe earns a raise. Historians still argue whether early legis actions were truly as rigid as later sources mock them, say the wrong word, lose the farm, or whether that rigidity is a rhetorical foil used to praise the formula system. Fragments suggest both austerity and ingenuity. Ritual mattered, but clever magistrates found edges to soften. The procedural evolution is real, the caricature may be exaggerated. Either way, by the late Republic the formula world dominates and Rome's legal imagination runs on conditionals. Because you sue for outcomes, not declarations, remedies get granular. Specific restitution exists, but money is the lingua franca, value at date of judgment, sometimes, at date of loss, other times, highest value in the last year, Aquilian, multiples, theft, or symbolic penalties, insult. Equitable nudges appear in bona fide suits, interest from demand, costs to the winner, discretion to reduce an oppressive clause. The result is a city where merchants can price risk because courts price harm. Enforcement is prosaic but effective. Win, and the judge's condemnatio turns into execution, seizure of goods, bonorum possessio in the creditor's favor, sale of assets, and in worse cases, a dignified version of personal pressure that stops short of the grim bondage the tables once permitted. A notorious debtor might face bonorum venditio, a quasi-auction of his estate to a bonorum emptor, along with a social frostbite that makes future credit harder than stoic homework. Rome understands that shame can be a collection agency too. Sometimes the action targets a shadow, agency, and households. If a slave or son makes contracts in a shop with a hanging sign and a cash box, the actio instatoria or exercitoria reaches the master or shipowner. If a child hurts someone during family business, the noxal action lets the father either pay damages or surrender the wrongdoer, noxi deditio, a harsh relic that practice gradually civilizes with payments. You can feel the law tracing accountability along the routes money actually travels. Light joke 3. A pompous neighbor declares, "I have a right to silence." The praetor replies, "Splendid, select the action that gives it to you." The neighbor blinks. The clerk writes, "No action lies for metaphors." Mainstream anchor as we dim the lamps, procedural two-stage justice, inure before the magistrate, a pud iudicem before a private judge, the centrality of actions, the taxonomy of in rem/in personam, and the rise of bona fide actions are bedrock in Gaius and later digest excerpts. The edict's architecture. To aid, supplement, correct. The civil law is the jurist's own motto. Rome builds outcomes first, principles afterward. Historians still argue whether the action system made Roman law brilliant or blinkered. Did focusing on remedies prevent the development of abstract rights? Or did it keep the law healthily empirical? Modern codes talk about rights. Roman practice taught generations of lawyers to ask, "What writ gets me home?" The debate is charming and, in a market, irrelevant. Remedies pay rent. By night the forum quiets, and you realize why the city sleeps at all. Citizens know which door to knock on when wrong. Tomorrow you'll see section SIXS procedural metamorphosis from ritual legis actions to tailored formulas unfold more clinically, but tonight the takeaway is simple enough to whisper over a lamp. In Rome, justice is not a feeling or a motto, it's a path you can walk, with milestones labeled actio, exceptio, condemnatio. You tidy your notes, thank the praetor's scribe who pretends not to enjoy compliments, and head home through streets that remain civilized precisely because, if necessary, they can be lit by a lawsuit. You stand in a small, solemn space where words are heavier than witnesses. Two men grasp a rod, yes, an actual switch of wood called the vindicta, over a bronze scale, while a copper coin clinks like a punctuation mark. One recites a line older than his haircut, the other recites back. A single syllable wobbles and a case tilts. Welcome to the world of legis actions, Rome's earliest procedural theater, where you win not only because you are right, but also because you remember the script. It is beautiful in the way a ritual can be, predictable, public, perilous. There are 5 classic legis actions, all love letters to form. Sacramentum, the wager action, settles ownership by staking money, the sacramentum, and letting the loser forfeit to the state, a neat way to turn quarrel into revenue. Iudicis postulatio, a request for a judge, handles certain fixed claims without wagers. Condictio, for a sum certain or a specific thing, demands a formal notice and a 30-day wait, because even impatience needed a calendar. Manus iniectio, laying hands, enforces judgments and certain debts with literal seizure of the debtor, a grim choreography tied to the 12 tables' older ways. Pignoris capio, taking a pledge, let specific creditors, soldiers for pay, priests for dues, snatch a pledge on the spot, intoning set words like legal thunder. Miss a word and you risk losing the farm. Hit them all and you've impressed both priest and scribe. Mainstream anchor, solid as a bronze scale. The fragments in Gaius 4.11:30 sketch the legis action system, its ritual precision, and its limited scope. The action by sacramentum famously plays out with the parties touching the disputed thing, or a symbol of it, while claiming, "I say this slave is mine ex quiritium." Then dueling by deposit. The judge later decides who is bluffing the gods. The state pockets the loser's wager. It is law as duel with adverbs. But life hates choreography that trips honest feet. Commerce grows. Litigants multiply. Foreigners arrive with wallets but no Latin. Minor mistakes ruin major merits. A more forgiving instrument begins to hum under the city's noise. The formula. A written instruction prepared by the praetor and handed to a lay judge, tailoring the suit in clean conditional language. Think of it as Rome trading a ritual mask for a legal blueprint. You watch the transition in real time. The plaintiff appears in year before the praetor, not to stage a sacred skit but to request an actio from the edict and a formula to match. The magistrate composes a compact, an intentio. If it appears that the defendant ought to give the plaintiff 10, a condemnatio. Condemn the defendant in that amount. If not, absolve. Maybe a demonstratio, which transaction we're talking about, plus any defenses, exceptions, the defendant raises and the plaintiff's replies, replications. The judge receives this little rectangle of logic and conducts a fact trial apud judicem. The magic isn't in pronouncing words exactly. It's in proving them true. Historians still argue whether the shift was a single legislative turn or a long slide assisted by several statutes and a mountain of Praetorian creativity. The Lex Abutia, 2nd century BC, almost certainly widened the doorway, authorizing formula procedure broadly and shoving most civil suits out of the ritual nest. Two legis actions, for damnum under the Lex Aquilia and for hereditas, lingered longer. By the late Republic the formula had largely won. Later, Hadrian's Edictum Perpetuum, shaped by Julian, standardizes the edict, and with it, the formulas, into a durable skeleton. The short version, the praetor pilates, statutes ratify, jurists explain. The advantages feel like fresh air. First, flexibility. The formula lets the praetor lace a suit with defenses that conscience approves. Exceptio doli, fraud, metus, duress, pactum conventum, later modification, without inventing a new universe every time. Second, intelligibility. Litigants no longer perform in archaic idioms. A judge reads a clear if then, and decides. Third, reach. Foreigners can litigate under boni fidei formulas without learning the priestly declensions of copper. Fourth, mercy's safety valve. The praetor slips in arbitria. What a good man would judge, and restitutio in integrum when strictness would shame the law. Light joke 1. An old school advocate complains. In my day we won by the perfect word. The praetor replies, today you'll win by a complete sentence. The scribe records both as precedent for good humor. Look at enforcement, where the change feels gentler too. Under manus iniectio, a judgment debtor might be seized and marched through the market, given 60 days to find a savior, then face sail trans Tiberim, across the river, in the oldest, harshest tales. Formula-based execution shifts the drama to property. A bonorum venditio or bonorum distractio, sale or distribution of assets, invites a bonorum emptor to step into the debtor's shoes at a discount and pay creditors. Shame still bites, but wrists remain unshackled. Rome learns to collect in coin rather than in bodies, good for commerce, better for sleep. The formula system also unleashes the jurists. Because language is now architecture, not liturgy, legal intellects, Cato, Scaevola, Labio, later Papinian, Ulpian, Paul, argue about wording, design defenses, and craft fictions. Want to help a possessor who nearly finished the Usicapio clock but was interrupted by procedural mischief? Enter the Actio Publiciana, a formula that treats him as if time had run. Need to reach a principle for his shopman's contract? Draft an Actio Instatoria that names the shopman in the intentio and the principal in the condemnatio. The subjunctive becomes a tool of justice, as if stops sounding like cheating and starts sounding like equity. Mainstream Peg, Gaius 4.30, 44 describes the anatomy of the formula: intentio, demonstratio, adjudicatio, condemnatio, and the layering of exceptions and replications. Digest fragments preserve scores of model clauses. How to build a condictio for sums, a formula in factum, in fact, for novel wrongs, or a bona fide template that hands the judge discretion. This is the Republic's engineering phase: measured timber, tight joints, no more sacred glue. The change repaces litigation. Under the old system, a single verbal misstep at the in-your stage could doom the suit before facts saw daylight. Under the formula, error lives downstream where it can be corrected. Misframed intentio? Amend. Missing defense? Add an exceptio. Surprise inequity? The praetor writes a fiction or grants restitutio. Not every mercy is granted. Abuse is policed by professional frowns. But the law now behaves like a craftsman willing to sand an edge. Quirky tidbit. Advocates kept miniature formula books. Portable libraries of clauses, exceptions, and replies, with favorite Iudices names penciled in the margins. Marcus likes concise condemnatio. Publius hates long demonstratio. Bring figs for both. Another. Some praetors displayed particularly elegant formulas in their atrium like hunting trophies, which is how you know you live in a city where grammar hunts problems. Criminal procedure shadows this evolution too. While the civil side shifts to formulas, public prosecutions settle into questions perpetui, standing jury courts presided over by praetors with model charges. The ritualism of assemblies trying capital cases recedes. Written heads of accusation and fixed panels rise. Sulla's reforms rationalize and politicize the map. Later men unrationalize and re-rationalize it. Through it all, the civil formula remains the quiet star of daily justice. Historians still argue whether the formula system democratized access or simply replaced one priesthood, pontiffs, with another, jurists and advocates. Literacy rises, paperwork spreads, fees accumulate. Perhaps the poor traded one gate for another. Yet the record shows freedmen suing, foreigners recovering, women enforcing dowries, action by action, because a door existed that didn't demand a sacred accent. The fairest judgment, the formula widened the hallway even if it didn't move all the furniture. Zoom back to see the ideology hiding in the machinery. Legis actions assume law is a ritual you enter. Formulas assume law is a problem you solve. The old world trusts words spoken in exactly the ancestral way. The new trusts written instructions aimed at a remedy. The first is religion's cousin. The second is engineering's sibling. Neither is immoral. Both are Roman. The second travels better with merchants, provinces, and time. Light joke too. A Greek merchant, nervous, asks if he must recite Latin to sue. The clerk says, "Only your contract must. Your accent is safe." Light joke 3. A praetor tells a young advocate, "Do not shout Iustitia, whisper formula." The advocate whispers and wins. Even foreclosure becomes less theatrical. The bonorum emptor who buys a debtor's estate under formula-based execution stands in a legal fiction as the debtor's universal successor, armed with actio riddleiana to sue in his new persona. Creditors coordinate, recover proportionally, and return to business. Contrast that with the older Manus Iniectio parade and you feel a culture toggling from shame display to account closure. The empire will eventually take a further step, cognitio extra ordinem, a single-stage, official judge process where the magistrate, or imperial delegate, both frames and decides the case. That's Section 7's sunrise. For now, the formula is Rome's golden mean: magistrate frames, citizen judges, jurist guides, scribe records, remedy pays. The city can scale without snapping. Mainstream aside to tie the ribbon. The Lex Julia Iudiciaria packages jury courts. The Lex Aburtia loosens the ritual knot. Hadrian's standardization under Julian freezes the mature edict. Juristic schools, Sabinians and Proculians, debate nuances and formulas as if arguing over the correct spice for a famous sauce. The digest later preserves their recipes, which is why modern law students still taste Roman seasoning in their syllabi. Historians still argue whether the old actions truly vanished or lived on as ceremonial ghosts. Some remnants, like sacramentum language, haunt later rhetoric. Notaries cherish antique flourishes. Conservative minds always keep one foot in marble. Yet court records, papyri, and juristic treatises agree. The living bloodstream of private justice ran through formulas. By dusk you can feel the pressure drain from words. Litigants leave holding not the memory of a mispronounced syllable, but a written path to a decision. The praetor's album gleams with clauses that promise help. The judge's tablets carry decisions that turn flour into bread and claims into coin. You head home past a scribe wiping a formula clean to copy another, grateful to live in a city that learned to replace magical sentences with intelligible ones, and by doing so, turn fairness from a ceremony into a service. You arrive not at a praetor's bustling bench, but at a governor's audience chamber, where the furniture already gives away the plot. No private iudex waits to receive a tidy formula. Instead, the official himself, curule chair, notary at his elbow, files stacked like disciplined geese, will hear, weigh, and decide. Welcome to cognitio extra ordinem, the imperial way of judging. Outside the ordinary recipe, which slowly becomes the ordinary everywhere the emperor's ink can reach. The choreography changes from your first step. Instead of begging an actio from the edict, you submit a libellus conventionis, a written petition that says who you are, what happened, what you want. A litus denunciatio, summons, goes out under the court's seal. A day is fixed. The clerk writes your names into a register, and you begin a process that is less dual and more dossier. The magistrate, governor, prefect, imperial delegate, presides from start to finish, frames the issues, hears evidence, questions witnesses, allows documents, and pronounces judgment. Two-stage procedure collapses into one. The judge is no longer a respectable layman but an officer with rank and stationary. Mainstream anchor to keep the floor from tilting. By the high empire, the cognitio motto runs alongside the formula system in many fora, especially for cases involving the fisc, imperial finances, status questions, and petitions to officials. In the later 3rd and 4th centuries, it becomes standard. Edicts and juristic fragments sketch the shift. Imperial rescripts, written answers to petitions, preserved in the Codex Gregorianus, Codex Hermogeneanus, and later the Codex Theodosianus show officials instructing litigants to proceed by cognitio, with records, clerks, and appeals up the ladder to higher governors, prefects, and ultimately the emperor. The courtroom acquires paperwork like a legion acquires dust. The evidentiary world loosens and tightens at once. Gone are the rigid if-then formulae. In comes a judge's free inquiry, libera cognitio. He can call witnesses ex officio, order documents produced, commission an expert, the surveyor, the shipwright, the accountant who can smell forged numbers. He keeps minutes, acta, so that anyone reviewing the case later can follow the path. He can adjourn for good reason rather than because the calendar says so. Light joke 1. The clerk mutters that adjournments are granted for illness, storms, and missing goats. The governor replies that only 2 of those count. The clerk promises to interview the goat. You feel the empire's taste for writing in everything. Petitions are copied, replies docketed, reasons summarized. Even justice that leans on conscience must leave a paper trail. The upside, appeals become meaningful. Under cognitio, you can carry your complaint upward, provocatio in a new, bureaucratic key, to the provincial superior, to a diocesan vicarius, to a praetorian prefect, and if stamina and stakes warrant, to the emperor by appellatio. The official above reads the acta rather than hears gossip, and can confirm, amend, or quash. The downside, delays that preferring to sleep. Light joke 2, an advocate whispers that an appeal is a ladder with excellent rungs and very distant roofs. Enforcement changes tone 2. In the formula world, creditors often executed through semi-private mechanisms, bonorum venditio, a sale of assets with social frost. In cognitio, the judge's officium staff can seize property, install possessors, garnish incomes, and write orders to city authorities. Judgments are writ large, do X by date Y or meet the apparitors. Contumacy, stubborn no-shows, earns fines, seizure, even arrest. The state's hand is visible and administrative. The neighborhood crowd becomes less necessary for muscle. Historians still argue whether cognitio was born as a special track exception, extra ordinem, that metastasized for convenience, or as a principled imperial reform aiming at rational, written justice. The sources show both strains. Early rescripts treat it as an extraordinary favor. Later constitutions normalize it. Either way, the empire discovers that record-heavy judging travels better across provinces than formulae do, especially when governors rotate and archives don't. Substance bends with the procedure. Deadlines and litis contestatio, the old moment when a suit, joined issue, and froze certain rights, weaken or shift. Judges can admit late evidence for cause. Minors get blanket mercies without begging a praetor. The notorious rule that slaves' testimony required torture in some serious matters lingers in stern texts. But cognitio courts increasingly weigh written proofs and free testimonies. Elite discomfort and practical doubts push toward other forms of verification. Mainstream peg, imperial constitutions from Antoninus Pius onward curbed routine tortures and stressed proportionality. By the 4th century, bishops' advocacy and administrative tastes further discourage casual cruelty, though the dark tool never fully vanishes. Rome learns that paper can, sometimes, do what pain pretended to. Rescripts give the system its conversational heartbeat. A town elder writes to the emperor, "Our curator sees the widow's vineyard. Must she sue him where he works or where the vines grow?" The emperor, or his legal secretaries, replies in a few sharp lines, stamped and circulated. "Jurisdiction lies where the property sits. Restore possession pending judgment." These responses, collected by jurists into private codes, Gregorianus, Hermogeneanus, and then public ones, Theodosianus, teach governors how to sing the same tune. Quirky tidbit, scribes often jotted docket notes in the margins. Answered swiftly, petition lacked map, village sent figs. Which is how you know even empires run on snacks. Fees and advocacy adapt. Officials regulate sportually, lawyers gratuities, and court costs. Fee schedules appear in edicts so that justice costs a known amount rather than a rumor. Advocates gain licenses and reputations. Some attach to governors' courts the way brave moths attach to large lamps. Written briefs thicken. Rhetoric thins into something judges can quote in the reasons section. Light joke 3. A young orator sighs that cognitio awards too few applause lines. His mentor says it awards more judgments, which by more dinners. The old and new systems coexist for a while. In Rome's city courts and many private disputes, the formula keeps humming through the 2nd century. In provincial and imperial matters, fiscus, status, petitions, administrative wrongs, cognitio dominates. Diocletian's great administrative resorting, late 3rd century, and Constantine's legislative blizzard, early 4th, tilt the balance decisively. By Justinian's day, the two-stage formula is a classroom fossil, admired and excerpted in the digest while courts read libelli and file acta. Mainstream aside, compact as a rubric, Diocletian's rescripts, a motherlode in the private codes, show everyday cognitio. Dowries, leases, boundary stones, with officials ordering surveys, balancing equities, and calling crafty landlords to heel. Constantine's laws standardize appeal windows and condemn bribery with theatrical threats. Theodosius II's Codex Theodosianus gives a public anthology of constitutions organized by topic. Judges now have a bookshelf that outlives governors. The structure of judging becomes legible policy, not just sturdy habit. What about equity? It flourishes. Without the straitjacket of a formula, judges can adjust for fraud, duress, mistake, minority, and sheer outrageous facts. The old Praetorian motto, to aid, supplement, correct the civil law, moves indoors and pins a nameplate to the judge's desk. You see restitutio in integrum granted to soldiers absent on campaign, to minors hustled into bad bargains, to widows ambushed by clever heirs. You also see the warning label, equity belongs to the conscientious, caprice wears the same perfume. Appeals and records keep conscientiousness honest. Historians still argue whether cognitio widened access to justice or raised a new barrier of literacy and expense. Formula litigation needed a good advocate and a willing iudex. Cognitio needs forms, copies, fees, patience, and luck with bureaucrats. The papyri show both stories, poor petitioners winning land back from greedy curiales, and also widows begging remissions of court costs. The fairest verdict is mixed. The door grew taller and broader. Some found it easier, others found it farther. Criminal law wears the same new coat. Standing jury courts, questions fade. Governors and prefects try crimes by inquiry, write reasons, sentence, and forward severe cases for confirmation. Treason, forgery, kidnapping, public violence, each gets an imperial paragraph in the codes and a judge with an officium to enforce it. Proof is more written, punishment more bureaucratic, mercy more petitionable. Senate trials recede into ceremony. Dossiers become drama. Jurists, far from disappearing, migrate into the files. Their opinions, Papinian's measured sentences, Ulpian's distinctions, Paul's tidy categories, get excerpted into casebooks and quoted in judgments. Constantine and later emperors even give certain jurists works formal authority. If they disagree, follow the majority. If tied, follow Papinian. Law schools in Berytus and Constantinople teach from these books to feed the court's hunger for trained pens. The empire keeps its brain even as it changes hands. Quirky tidbit 2. Court hours are posted on tablets like shop schedules, 3rd hour to midday, with a siesta that neither litigants nor lizards can appeal. Another, some governors kept a public complaint day, where petitioners could line up without appointment. The clerk weighed petitions in his palm and sometimes guessed the outcome by heft, which is why sensible people sewed fewer wax seals and wrote more facts. By dusk you notice how the room feels. Less theatrical than the praetor's forum, more administrative and, oddly, more personal. The judge looks you in the eye when he asks why you didn't complain sooner. The notary asks you to spell your village twice. The usher calls your name like a small trumpet. You miss the elegance of formulae and the dignity of private iudices. You also appreciate that a single hand now frames, hears, and signs. If he errs, there is a file to carry upward. If he is wise, there is a reason to read. Mainstream peg to close the ledger. The late antique codes, Gregorianus, Hermogeneanus, Theodosianus, and Justinian's later Codex/Digest memorialize the triumph of cognitio. procedural rubrics on libelli, citations, appeals, costs, and execution become standard headings. What began extra ordinem ends in ordinem. Historians still argue whether the empire lost something essential when it retired the citizen judge and embraced the official's desk. Did civic participation shrink? Did legality grow? You can hold both thoughts and still admire the continuity. Rome kept promising remedies, just changed how it delivered them. You step back into the corridor. A soldier signs for his wage arrears. A nun petitions about a vineyard boundary. A merchant files an appeal tied with a cord he hopes is lucky. The usher snuffs the lamp with the same care a praetor's scribe once wiped a formula clean. Different furniture, same promise. Bring your grievance, get a path. Tomorrow we'll watch the jurists who made these paths navigable turn opinions into doctrine thick enough to survive emperors. You duck into a cool portico where law does its thinking. No lictors, no axes, no trumpets, just shelves of papyrus, a sleepy clerk with ink on his thumb, and a man who can turn a quarrel into a paragraph. This is a jurist's study, where Rome invents a quiet superpower, answers. Not decrees, not votes, responsa prudentium, the opinions of learned men, and occasionally learned women in practice, though the titles skew male, that magistrates trust, judges quote, and merchants carry away like signed guarantees. If the praetor builds doors, the jurist labels them, oils the hinges, and writes instructions so the next traveler won't stub a toe. Mainstream anchor to steady the desk. From Augustus onward, select jurists receive the ius publis respondendi ex auctoritate principis, the right to give opinions, by the emperor's authority. Their written or sealed responses can guide judges, sometimes with near-binding persuasive force. Earlier, the prudence already advised. Augustus simply put a purple ribbon on the practice and made uniformity less a rumor. You can picture it. A magistrate hesitates, a courier hurries, a jurist seal arrives, and the case now leans where doctrine says gravity lives. The room hums with genres. On one shelf sit institutions, teaching books, tidy enough for first-year minds. Another holds digesta, case-based discussions, like a conversation in long paragraphs. There are responsa, Q&A packets tied with string, each a miniature rescue. Questions present thorny hypotheticals, regularly condense habits into aphorisms. Liber singularis, those one-off monographs, obsess over a single topic with affectionate severity. You can feel the outlines of a later law school here, because this already is one. Names gather like colleagues. There is Capito the conservative and Labio the innovator, sparring across dinner tables and launching two teaching schools, Sabinians, Capito/Sabinus, and Proculians, Labio/Proculus. Historians still argue whether those schools were tight institutions with membership rolls or looser tendencies, a branding for styles rather than buildings. The safest sentence says they were rival approaches that sharpened each other, one hugging statutes, one hugging equity, both in love with clarity. You pull down Gaius, the 2nd century schoolmaster whose institutes teach beginners and, by accident, future empires. He walks you through persons, things, and actions with a voice so lucid you check the label twice. Light joke 1. The clerk claims Gaius is so clear even a banker can read him. The banker says he prefers footnotes that earn interest. You slide to Julian, Hadrian's draftsman of the Edictum Perpetuum, who freezes the living Praetorian edict into a standardized masterpiece while adding comments that make formulas behave. Then Scaevola, then Sabinus, then Celsus, he of the handsome maxim, Ius est ars boni et equi, law is the art of the good and the fair, each voice a chisel on Rome's granite. Now the heavy trio strolls in, Papinian, Ulpian, Paul. Papinian, the measured conscience of the Severan age, writes with a fairness that sounds like a held breath. Ulpian, civil service genius, systematizes like a man rearranging a warehouse into aisles you can actually walk. Paul is precise, prolific, and occasionally playful, footnotes that flirt. Modestinus, the last classical star, gathers the dusk's light into elegant summaries. When Justinian's commissioners later sift Rome's entire juristic mountain for the digest, more than a third will be Ulpian, a large slice Paul, and a generous plate Papinian, statistics that say. These voices last. Mainstream anchor, stamped with a seal, the law of citations, 426e, elevates Papinian, Paul, Gaius, Ulpian, and Modestinus as the 5 most authoritative jurists for late Roman courts. If they split, follow the majority. If tied, follow Papinian. If Papinian is silent, the judge decides. It's an official reading list with a tiebreaker, proof that opinions have become a constitution of sentences. Light joke 2, a hairy judge says. When in doubt, I ask Papinian. The clerk says. And when Papinian is in doubt, the judge replies, we adjourn for lunch. How do these opinions travel from library to lawsuit? A magistrate or judge solicits a written responsum, sometimes sealed for authenticity. Advocates carry private collections of famous replies. Students copy excerpts like gospel for scribes. Under the ius respondendi, a jurist's signed answer can tip a case without the author even entering the room. In practice, persuasion reigns, strong arguments convince, weak ones get politely shelved, and reputation does the rest. You can feel the Republic's old distrust of single voices mellowing into a respect for well-lit minds. Quirky tidbit: some jurists ran what looked like bustling clinics, clients on benches, students at their feet, secretaries sorting petitions by smell, vinegar for leases, smoke for servitudes, garum for partnership squabbles. A slave trained as a notarius could take dictation as fast as gossip. A freedman librarian knew which row cracked on the same question last spring. In this small economy, wisdom has payroll. Doctrine shapes practice, practice reshapes doctrine. Consider bona fides. Jurists take the praetor's good faith actions and unpack implied duties, disclose defects, cooperate in performance, refrain from sabotage. Consider dolus, fraud, and metus. Duress, they define what counts as trickery or fear worth unwinding. Consider usucapio. They draw tidy exceptions, no usucapio of stolen goods, then invent the publician action to protect a nearly ripened possessor. Each move is incremental and surgical. Rome's brilliance lies less in grand theory than in the way doctrine keeps up with invoices. Historians still argue whether jurists were mostly independent scholars or half-civil servants drafting imperial rescripts behind curtains. The truth does both. Some advise governors, some ghostwrite emperors' answers, some teach grandsons of senators, some adjudicate as delegates. The line between pen and power blurs, and the blur is productive. You, as a litigant, rarely care which desk produced the sentence you quote. You care that quoting it persuades. You watch one responsum earn its keep. A widow asks whether a dowry farm, mortgaged for her husband's debts, must be surrendered now that she's suing for return of the dowry. The jurist cites a line of opinions. Dowry recovers to the wife with narrow deductions. Creditors who knew the status take their place in line, not in front. He phrases it with the gentleness of arithmetic. Let her be restored with equity. Let necessary outlays be retained. The judge, who likes equity best when someone spells it, writes the same sentence with fewer adjectives and more stamps. The farm walks home. Law schools, real ones, form around these voices. In Rome and later Beirut, students memorize definitions, argue hypothetical cases, and learn to copy cleanly. The libri singulars on dowry, tutors, interdicts, and the fiscus become syllabi. Model formulae become drills. Papinian becomes the standard by which a young advocate measures his courage and his commas. Exams look like lawsuits. Lawsuits look like exercises done slower. Light joke 3. A student asks the master, "What is law?" The master says, "What's left after the copyist makes 3 mistakes?" The student laughs nervously and sharpens his stylus. Imperial bureaucracy eats and digests juristic prose. Rescripts cite them, edicts echo them. The early private code books, Gregorianus, Hermogeneanus, collect imperial answers flavored by juristic phrasing. The Codex Theodosianus, 438, turns the imperial stream into a public fountain. Finally, in the 6th century, Justinian orders Tribonian and colleagues to compile the Digest/Pandex, the Institutes, and a Codex of Constitutions. They excerpt, harmonize, and sometimes polish, modern scholars say, interpolate, the classics to fit current procedure. Historians still argue whether some lines in the digest are truly Ulpian or a later editor speaking in his toga. The debate is a scholarly sport with real stakes. The practical effect in Justinian's time was uniformity with footnotes hidden. Back in our century of Ulpians, the tone of a responsum matters. Papinian writes like a judge who has seen grief. He weighs consequences as if people will live inside them. Ulpian writes like a department head, efficient, exhaustive, ready for filing. Paul writes like a lecturer who knows when to stop. Modestinus writes like a closure that doesn't slam. Between them, they turn the ius civil and the ius honorarium into a language so sturdy that medieval glossators will later stand on it to build cathedrals of commentary. Not every opinion wins. Some die in footnotes. Some survive as cautionary exhibits. Some get overruled by a later emperor who prefers a different verb. Jurists know this and write with layered modesty. Plerunc, for the most part, videmus, let us see, the occasional. Unless equity urges otherwise. Their sentences are strong, but the hinges remain visible. Quirky tidbit 2. A few jurists loved maxims that sound like fridge magnets in Latin. Consent makes marriage. No one can transfer more right than he has. What is owed becomes the creditor's. Fraud and force infect even the most righteous contract. They travel well because they summarize rooms of argument in one line. The danger is students who wield them like hammers. The cure is a teacher with eyebrows. By dusk you see why Rome's legal legacy feels coherent across centuries of political chaos. The state changed hands. The sentences stayed useful. Magistrates came and went. Jurists kept labeling shelves. The action system of sections 5 to 6 gave courts a way to move. The cognitio of section 7 gave governors a way to write. The jurists give everyone a way to think. When you ask a Roman judge, why? He doesn't point to a person. He points to a paragraph. Mainstream pegged to close the folio. The juristic corpus quoted in Justinian's Digest, 533 c, draws heavily on Papinian, Ulpian, Paul, Gaius, and Modestinus. The earlier law of citations had already canonized their authority in late courts. Augustus Ius Respondendi formalized the advisory pipeline. The rest, schools, rescripts, codebooks, stitched practice to principles so tightly that later civil codes, from medieval gloss to modern Napoleonic airs, read like Rome speaking with contemporary accents. You step out from the study into evening. The clerk sands a fresh responsum. A messenger heads toward a governor who dislikes guessing. A merchant folds a paragraph that just saved him a year of sleep. You realize the empire's most durable monument isn't an aqueduct or a road, it's a habit of answering well. Tomorrow, property and possession will take the stage, Section 9's dance of title, control, and time. But tonight, let the room's quiet boast linger. Here, opinions are infrastructure. You place your hand on a bronze key and realize Roman law cares less about keys than about hands. Who holds, who may keep holding, and when holding ripens into owning, this is the city's favorite trilogy. Title, Dominum Exuquiritium, is the crown. Possession, possessio, is the cloak that keeps you warm while the crown is fetched. Time, Eusecapio, is the clock that, if conditions smile, turns cloak into crown. You will spend today moving between those layers with the care of someone carrying amphory over a tiled floor. Begin with title in its old, aristocratic wardrobe. For the best sort of ownership over the best sort of things, residential mancipi, italic land, rural servitudes, beasts of burden, and slaves, the ancestral law used ceremonial transfers, mancipatio with copper and scales, or in your sessio before a magistrate. Everything else, residential nec mancipi, could pass by simple delivery, traditio. The system is a museum of antiquity and convenience in the same room. Mainstream fact to set like a boundary stone. By the late Republic and early Empire, practice had shifted vast traffic to traditio, especially for movables and even for much urban property, while formalities survived where prestige or priesthoods insisted. But Rome rarely lets elegance block commerce. Imagine you buy an ox by delivery alone from someone who lacks full title. Civil law shrugs, no dominem yet. The praetor, who dislikes shrugs, arms you with protection. He treats you as bonitary owner, shields your possession with interdicts, and even grants the actio publiciana, a clever lawsuit that lets you argue as if the period of Eusecapio had already run. Light joke 1. You tell your neighbor your ownership is bonitary. He nods as if that were a color. The judge nods because it spends like one. Possession itself is not a right in marble but a fact with guards. To possess, you need corpus, physical control, and animus, the will to hold as yours. Tenants and borrowers have detentio, holding for another, not possession full-blooded. Thieves possess in fact but gain no hogs from the law. The praetor stabilizes the streets with interdicts, summary orders that freeze a situation. Uti Possididus keeps the current possessor of land in place pending trial, unless he got it by force, stealth, or precarium. Utrubi, in classical law, awards movables to the person who possessed them most in the past year. Undays 6 restores a possessor violently ousted. De precario whips back a borrower who overstays hospitality. These aren't declarations of ownership. They are acknowledgments that chaos hates deadlines. Now the alchemy, Eusecapio. If you possess a thing long enough with the right ingredients, title crystallizes. The recipe, memorized by first-year students and landlords, a thing capable, residential habilis, a proper cause, iesta causa, sale, gift, dowry, legacy, good faith at the start, bona fides, possession without nasty origins, not stolen, not grabbed by force, and time, traditionally 1 year for movables, 2 for land in Italy. Meet the elements and click, civil ownership dawns. Historians still argue whether bona fides must endure through the whole period or is only required at the inception. Classical texts favor the latter, while later moralists shake fingers at persistent obliviousness. Provincial land posed a doctrinal hiccup, technically the Roman people or the emperor-owned conquered soil. Locals held under tax, tributum, and grant. The praetors and governors solved life by protecting long-holding through longa temporis prescriptio, a defense for those who possessed land for a long stretch, 10 or 20 years, depending on presence/absence. Later, in the post-classical period, longissimi temporis, 30 or 40 years, made very old injustices politely unlitigable. The message to empires and neighbors alike: if you sleep on your claims long enough, the law will tuck you in. Title and possession flirt constantly through the devices of the workshop. Accessory follows principle, accessio. When your beams become part of my house, the house swallows them and you get a money claim. Mixtures, confusio, commixtio, turn your wine and my wine into our headache, which the judge prices with a sober face. New species, specificatio. If I make a statue from your bronze, who owns the statue? Sabinians, channeling, matter matters, say you do. Proculians, cheering, form wins, say the maker does. The compromise counts whether the bronze can be reduced. Quirky tidbit. Craftsmen kept reverse recipes on tablets, tests for whether purple dye could be unmade, because sometimes the law's answer hinged on chemistry more than charm. Fruits, fructus, have their own calendar. Civil owners own fruits when separated. Possessors in good faith often keep what they already picked, fructus percepti, and may even set off necessary expenses. Bad faith possessors must disgorge fruits they took and pay for those they let rot. Justice is not fond of lazy pirates. Light joke 2. A tenant claims fallen figs are acts of the gods. The landlord says so are rent demands. The judge introduces both to the concept of timing. Not everything sits on the market's shelf. Sacred and religious things, temple property, tomb plots, are extra commercium, outside commerce. Public roads and rivers belong to everyone and uses the city recognizes. Treasure buried and rediscovered, thesaurus, gets a tidy Hadrianic rule in many tellings, split between landowner and finder if found by chance on private land. On public land, it belongs mostly to the fisc. Mainstream fact, classical sources treat treasure inconsistently. Later jurists report Hadrian's half and half as canon. Practice loved the certainty. Boys loved the idea of digging. Mothers loved filling the holes before ankles disappeared. Servitudes, easements, are property's gentle threads. Rural, right of way, right to draw water, right to drive cattle. Urban, rights to light and view, to drip eaves, or demand your neighbor stop. Created by emancipation or in your cessio in the old days, later by pact and long use under the praetor's smile. They are silent until violated, then very loud. Enforcement arrives through actions and interdicts that sound like polite grammar but feel like fences. Point. One of Rome's neatest fictions rescues buyers from sellers with missing titles. When you've bought and taken delivery in good faith but lack queritarian ownership, the Actio Publiciana lets you sue third parties as if you had completed usucapio. The defendant can parry with a superior title, exceptio iusti dominii, but against later grabbers you prevail. It is equity that looks like imagination and spends like law. Historians still argue whether the Publician fiction began life as a provincial workaround or an urban stroke of Praetorian genius. The digest keeps both doors ajar, as it does with many good stories. Boundaries deserve a hymn. Stones are sacred. Move one and you invite lawsuits and the gods' least theatrical disapproval. If a tree spreads roots or branches into a neighbor, the neighbor can demand trimming. If your building leans, the city leans harder. Surveyors, agrimensors, walk fields with cords, compasses, and attitudes. Their textbooks, sprinkled with diagrams and sarcasm, survive to show that geometry has always attracted tidy tempers. Light joke 3. An agrimensor says the world is straight. A sailor says it's curved. The judge says, "Pay rent, both of you." Good faith drives many corners. Deliver a thing intending to transfer and the recipient intending to receive, and traditio carries title where the civil law allows. No copper, no scales, just intent and cause. Deliver without cause, no sale, no gift, and nothing passes. The praetor may still invent a remedy to unwind illusions. Hidden defects are policed through actio redhibitoria, return with refund, and actio quanti minores, price reduction, in sales, making honesty cheaper than litigation, eventually, if not instantly. Historians still argue whether usucapio began as cure, fixing formal transfer defects, or as acquisition device aimed at stabilizing possession. The answer tastes of both. An owner who used the wrong ceremony can be rescued by time. A possessor whose title is cloudy can be clarified by years lived openly. They also argue provincial land's exact path from inalienable state ownership to practical private dominium under late law. The papyri and codes sing in different keys, and scholars hum along with selective harmonies. Enforcement keeps the promise realistic. Win a property action and you may recover the thing with fruits and damages. Lose and you at least learn where to stop claiming. Possessor interdicts work fast. Property actions slow but deep. Meanwhile, market custom does quiet heavy lifting. Seals on jars, stamps on bricks, titularly picty on amphory. The city broadcasts provenance because ownership prefers paper to poetry. By dusk you hold the bronze key again and feel what it symbolizes. Less a door than a timeline. Today you possess. Tomorrow, if the world behaves and the elements sit, you own. And if someone shoves, the praetor wedges the door until the judge arrives. Mainstream peg to close the ledger. Classical jurists in Justinian's Digest, Gaius, Ulpian, Paul, systematized dominium, possessio, usucapio, interdicts, accessio, specificatio, fruits, servitudes. Later compilers retain the architecture even as imperial procedure changes. The logic outlives the furniture. You blow out the lamp over a drawing of fields and pads, amused that the law of earth is mostly the law of patience. Hold steadily, act in good faith, count your months, mind your neighbors, and ask for remedies with verbs the praetor likes. Rome will not promise you treasure. It promises you time measured, possession protected, and ownership that arrives exactly when earned. You sit at a banker's table where the wood is polished by elbows and decisions. A seller sets down a tiny jar of grain to represent a warehouse. A buyer sets down a ring to represent coin. The notary sets down a wax tablet to represent memory. Rome does not ask whether you possess abstract rights. It asks whether you've made a contract the law recognizes, and if so, which action will walk it home. First, the universal skeleton, stipulatio. A call and response promise, audible like a drumline. Do you promise to pay 10? I promise. The words can be lean or fancy, Latin or Greek in many places, but the duet must match. No need to say why, cause can be elsewhere. The stipulatio is a legal spine you can hang terms on. You can secure loans, fix penalties, poeni, bind a tenant's repairs, or wrap a messy settlement in one clean Q&A. Mainstream fact. Jurists from Gaius onward teach stipulatio as the classic verbal contract, strict iuris, enforced by a straightforward condictio unless a praetorian defense bends it. You can almost hear the praetor smile when a deal arrives already in declarative mood. But Rome also loves agreements that breathe. Enter the 4 consensual contracts, formed by consent alone, no ceremony, each judged in bona fides, good faith emptio venditio, sale, locatio conductio, hire/lease, societas, partnership, and mandatum, gratuitous agency. In sale, price must be certain, or at least ascertainable. Hidden defects are no longer poetry, they are obligations. Aediles edicts police the market. Sellers of slaves and animals must disclose diseases and vices. Buyers may redebere, return, or seek quanti minores, price reduction. In lease, a damp, collapsing flat breaches habitability before mood. Your Section 9 ceiling remembers. Partnership demands accounts and atones civil enough for figs. Mandate must be free, though expenses are reimbursed because friendship and poverty are a poor mix. Light joke 1. A landlord says his ceiling participates in the festival by descending. The judge replies the festival will now be funded by damages. Real contracts arrive when things move. Mutuum, loan for consumption, gives bread, wine, or coin to be returned in kind and amount, strict iuris, with interest only if separately promised, and later policed. Commodatum, loan for use, is that neighborly latter, gratuitous, to be returned the same thing. Misuse is furtum usus, theft by use, and earns the borrower a moral lecture with bill. Depositum bailment stores your chest in my back room. Negligence pays, and the special depositum miserabile, forced deposit in calamity. punishes betrayal with double damages. Pignus pledge keeps your ring until the debt is paid. If I sell it too soon, the praetor sells me a lesson. Historians still argue whether arha, the earnest money or token in sales, creates, evidences, or merely penalizes breach. In practice, a ring or coin handed over says, "We intend this," and forfeiture or double return keeps waffling expensive. They also debate the infamous risk rule, periculum est temptoris. Does the buyer bear risk of accidental loss once the sale is perfected, even before delivery? Classical texts lean yes, with exceptions for seller's fault and impossibility. Modern scholars annotate margins the way merchants insure ships. Back to stipulatio, Rome's duct tape. Ad satis datio, surety sponsors, fide promissors, and most flexible, fideisors promise alongside the debtor. Later mercies appear. Beneficium divisionis lets a surety demand division among co-sureties. Beneficium excussionis makes the creditor attack the principal first. Beneficium or inus orders who stands where in the ring. Not all in your century yet, but the arc bends toward fairness you can summarize in a clause. Light joke 2. A debtor brings 3 sureties and calls them the graces. The creditor asks for the 4 virtues and gets 1 more signature. Literal contracts peep from ledgers. Nomina transcriptitia, book transfers in an adversaria, can crystallize obligations by tidy double entry. I write that you owe me 10. Mirrors. I paid your seller 10 for you. Later practice favors private IOUs, chirography and syngraphy, papers that say, I owe, in letters a judge can weigh. Bankers, argentarii, keep tablets that could make or unmake a reputation by a flick of stylus. The city trusts those numbers enough to let them testify louder than memories. Consensual sale holds its own cabinet of curiosities. Emptio re sperati, sale of expected thing, waits on harvest. If the crop fails without fault, no price, sensible. Emptio spe, sale of a hope, sells the chance itself. Your entire fish catch tonight, even if it's disappointment seasoned with salt, and the price stands because hope was the commodity. Latent defects trigger edilition remedies. Express warranties, dicta and promissa, stick when you brag beyond poetry. Earnest tokens whisper, don't ghost me. And delivery, traditio, moves title where I use civil doesn't demand copper or priests. Interest, usury, navigates between commerce and frowns. The old Nexum bondage yields to property liability. Remember Section 1's relief. But lending endures with rates that jurists, aediles, and emperors periodically fence. Maritime loans, Venus Nauticum, price storm and pirates with higher returns. If the ship arrives, the lender's nerves are paid for. Later constitutions set ceilings and privileges. Your century hears more maxims than police whistles, but stigma attends the shark. Mainstream fact, jurists distinguish usury due by agreement and those by operation, after default, and treat compounding warily. Emperors from Hadrian onward occasionally reset the dial. Partnership, societas, is friendship with ledgers. You and 2 cousins pool coin and competence. Losses and gains follow the pact, else proportioned by contribution. Any partner may dissolve with notice. Trust is the oxygen. Death, bankruptcy, or total object failure ends it. Actio pros socio enforces honesty with rhetoric sharp enough to slice figs, conceal profits, misappropriate funds, or turn lazy in busy seasons, and the judge will educate your calendar. Mandate, mandatum, is a gentleman's letter that grows teeth. I ask you to buy purple on my behalf. You do it prudently and I reimburse. You exceed mandate and I can ratify or refuse. You act for my credit and I owe you thanks that smells like coin. No fee allowed in the pure form. Jurists glare at paid agency. But practice slides a gift across the table that everyone pretends is gratitude. If a mandate benefits only the agent, the action vanishes. Rome doesn't enforce altruism fiction. Pax, pacta, are everywhere, and some wear armor. Naked pax, nuda pacta, lack actions but raise defenses, exceptions. Dress pax, pacta vestita, like constitutum debiti, a promise to pay an existing debt at a date, or pactum de non petendo, covenant not to sue, earn actions by praetorian grace. Adjoin pax, pacta adiacta, hitch to sales. If the mule limps within 10 days, refund. And courts honor them because commerce loves memory. Quirky tidbit. Taverns sometimes stamp clay tokens recording a constitutum for regulars, small round promises that bought one more jug and one more week. Suretyship and novation play chess with obligation. Fold 3 debts into one with the new stipulatio and the old melt. Switch debtors, ex promisio. When a rich uncle enters the chat, insert a pena clause that finds delay, because punctuality is justice's cousin. Novation requires intent, animus novandi, else you've just created twins. Jurists patrol that border like customs officers for promises. Historians still argue whether the periculum emptoris rule makes moral sense in all the edge cases. Fire after perfect sale but before weighing grain. Slaves who die between handshake and delivery. Ships lost after price fixed but bill not signed. The edict and jurists carve exceptions, sellers culpa, impossibility, mora, yet commentaries still heap baths in law schools. They also quarrel over when exactly a verbal promise binds in bilingual markets. Evidence suggests practice valued matching intent over phonetic purism, especially under the peregrinus praetor's hospitable eye. Enforcement, always the adult in the room, arrives on schedule. Strict contracts trigger conditions, sober, arithmetic suits. Good faith ones bring flexible actions boni fidei, adding implied duties, disclose, cooperate, mitigate loss. Depositaries face double for treachery and peril. Borrowers pay for broken ladders they climb too cleverly. Sellers swallow price cuts for mules advertised as poets. Light joke 3. A dealer claims a parrot speaks Latin. In court the bird only says de argentum. The judge says that's fluent enough to refund. Mainstream pegs to close your notebook. Gaius divides contracts into verba, literi, consensu. Edilician edicts govern market quality. Praetorian pacts become actions. Surety forms evolve, with fiducio outlasting the others. Constitutum, actio de dolo. And quanti minores anchor fairness. Later emperors cap interest and civilize surety. Burdens. The outline looks modern because modern codes cribbed from it with gratitude. You leave the table with the sense that Roman contract law is less a philosophy than a craft. Speak clearly, stipulatio, consent sensibly, consensuals, move things carefully, reals, write when prudent, literals, and always assume the judge will ask what a good person would have done at the time. Do that, and Section 5's actions will pay you, forget, and Section 3's defenses will educate you. Also, test the ceiling before leasing, and never buy a philosophical mule without a clause. You feel the city's pulse in its annoyances. A missing purse, a bruised cheek, a toppled jar, a neighbor's goat with modern ideas about fences. Rome meets these not with sermons but with price tags. Private wrongs, delicta, don't send you to prison, they send someone to the pay window. You don't ask, what sin was committed? You ask, which action fits and how much? Justice arrives as arithmetic with personality. Start with furtum, theft, which Romans define more mischievously than you expect, not just carrying off, but any dishonest meddling with a thing for gain, contractatio fraudulosa. The hand in your coin purse is obvious, so is the borrower, who uses your ladder to paint his own shop sign. The action split like a pomegranate. Actio furti manifesti punishes the caught in the act thief at fourfold value. Furti nec manifesti, not caught red-handed, pays at twofold. There's also the sober condictio furtiva to recover the value of the stolen thing itself. Multiples are penalties, civil fines that make dishonesty expensive at retail. Light joke 1. A boy claims he didn't steal figs, he merely tested their ripeness. The judge replies that the figs will now test his father's purse. Robbery, rapina, gets its own drum. Violence plus taking equals the actio 6 bonorum raptorum, a mixed remedy, fourfold within a year, one-fold compensation plus triple penalty, single after. The city distinguishes between stealth and swagger. Swagger pays extra for the noise. And because Rome believes in making receivers nervous, there are actions against the fence who handled what he pretends he didn't notice, and against the master who profits when his servant robs on shop time. Now step into injury, both to body and to dignity. Early law priced a broken bone like a chipped tile. Classical jurists turn injuria into a dignitary tort with teeth. Strike a citizen, tear her veil, stalk him with insults in the forum, write a lampoon. The actio injuriarum lets a judge calibrate damages to status, circumstance, and malice. Public insult outside the basilica costs more than a muttered annoyance at home. A slap to a senator's face ruins more than a cheek. You can waive honor, but not cheaply. Historians still argue whether the action primarily protected a communal sense of respect, public order, or private feeling, personal honor. The fragments speak both tongues, and the awards look like lectures priced in coin. Then the carpenter's favorite psalm, damnum injuria datum, wrongful damage under the lex Aquilia. The classical distillate, in Chapter 1, if you wrongfully kill a slave or herd animal, you owe the highest value the victim had in the last year. In Chapter 3, if you damage other property, mule, wine, wall, cloak, you owe the highest value in the last 30 days. Wrongfully, injuria, is the jurist's playground, at least fault, culpa, not necessarily spite, direct physical agency, corpore corpore, by body upon body, in the strict reading, broader causation in a kinder one. The judge counts like an honest merchant. What was the best market price in the window the statute names? If your neighbor crushed your vines right after a good rain, you will see him pay like the weather smiled on you. Mainstream anchor to plant like a boundary stone. The Lex Aquilia, traditionally 3rd century BC, is the foundation of Roman damages for wrongfully caused loss. Jurists from Gaius to Ulpian parse its chapters relentlessly, and Justinian later smooths its edges into a general action for damage caused by fault. The highest value measure is not a poet's flourish. It is a practical ceiling designed to deter clever undervaluation and to recognize speculative potential. Markets breathe. Damages breathe with them. Because Rome rarely leaves a crack unsealed, quasi-delicts sit beside delicts like sensible cousins. Nauta, capo, stabularius, shipmaster, innkeeper, stablekeeper, answer for theft or damage done by their staff to guests' goods. Call it strictish liability born of hospitality and suspicion. Deactum vel effusum, throw or pour something from a building and hurt someone below, you pay. Penal if a person, measured if property. Positum aut suspensum, hang a dangerous object over the street and it threatens passers-by. You owe a fixed penalty even if it never falls. Fear counts. The law polices gravity because gravity is lazy. Animals are citizens of the delict world, too. Actio de pauperi makes an owner pay when his quadruped, acting on its own animal impulse, not prodded by human command, causes damage. Your donkey kicks my amphory. Your cow introduces my fence to philosophy. If the owner prefers, he can surrender the animal, noxi deditio, a relic that lets households convert fur into coin with less drama. Light joke 2. A goose bites a praetor. The owner offers to surrender the goose. The praetor pardons the bird on account of its ancestors' service at the Capitol and charges the owner for the bandage. Fault, meanwhile, develops a Roman taxonomy. Dolus, fraud, sits at the top with a face that smiles while counting. Culpa lauda, gross negligence, is not seeing the amphitheater. Culpa levis, ordinary negligence, is not seeing the theater ticket. Culpa in concreto asks how careful this person usually is and holds them to their own standard. Your section 10, good person, makes a cameo. The judge's job is to place conduct on this sliding scale and then apply the action that fits. No one pretends the scale is anything but human. Witnesses, custom, and cross-examination supply the weight. Because wrongs often ripple through households, nuptial actions trace responsibility up the leash. A son in power or a slave causes harm. The father or master can pay or surrender the wrongdoer. In practice, civilized households pay. Surrender lingers as theater and threat. And because commerce puts subordinates at counters, the actio quod iussu, instatoria, and exercitoria reach principles for shopmen's or captain's misdeeds done in the line of business. You may not profit by delegation and then disclaim its consequences. Enforcement follows the civil rhythm you've learned. Delict actions often carry penalties, multiples, besides compensation. Some are infamantes. They brand the loser with infamia, a social legal smudge that makes future litigation harder and oaths heavier. Settlement is encouraged by arithmetic. Pay now and the multiple shrinks. Wait and your purse thins by design. Light joke 3. A defendant offers to pay an amphory of mediocre wine, at highest value in the last year. The judge replies, "Then will value your wine in my chambers, far from merchants." The edges are where jurists flex. What counts as direct under the Aquilian action? If you set a trap that a mule later trips, is that corpore corpore or clever causation? Classical strictness says, not direct. Praetorian equity invents a parallel actio in factum to catch the moral culprit. If a doctor's skillful treatment fails and the patient dies, is he liable? Historians still argue whether. Classical law excused the conscientious practitioner from Aquilian fault absent gross error, or demanded success harshly. The sources console careful doctors and scold quacks, which is what you hoped they would do. Repetition has its own policy. Thieves who practice as a hobby face escalated penalties. Robbers who recruit muscle invite criminal process as well as civil fines. Public crimes, extortion, poisoning, treason, live in the questions and later cognitio. Private wrongs live here with your purse and your neighbor's mule. The line whittles with politics, but the day-to-day city prefers suits that return things and hush tempers. Quirky tidbit. Some shopfronts kept a painted notice. No water or refuse thrown. Half legal warning, half prayer. Ediles love to find violators on market days and fund better paving stones. Another. Municipal bylaws sometimes set tariff damages for trampling the forum's flower beds during festivals. The priest's roses had a schedule more precise than many wages. Because reputations bruise as easily as fruit, injuria cases often end with public apologies staged as legal theater. The offender recites a formula in the forum acknowledging fault. The offended accepts. Damages are adjusted downward with ceremony valued higher than coin. Rome believes that dignity can be mended by words if those words are spoken loudly enough in front of neighbors who enjoy attendance. Mainstream aside to tie the ledger. The Digest Books 9, Aquilian, 47-48, Crimes and Quasi-Delicts, and Gaius 3 form the backbone of our knowledge. The Lex Aquilia text is fragmentary, but its doctrinal wake is tidal. Actio injuriarum, 30. 6 Bonorum raptorum, de pauperi, de fusus vel diectus, and the host-keeper liability actions outline a remarkably modern-sounding map. Later compilers, Justinian, generalize Aquilian fault into a proto-tort principle, which civil codes centuries hence will greet like an ancestor at a reunion. Historians still argue whether the multiples in theft were pure penalty or blended with compensation in complicated inventory cases. They also quarrel over whether Inuria remedies were mostly elite self-policing, honor clubs, or a democratized protection of personal dignity. Papyri show humble plaintiffs suing for bruises. Literature shows grand men suing for adjectives. Both can be true. The forum has many benches. By twilight, your day's wrongs have turned into tomorrow's entries. The purse is back, or its value is. The neighbor's goat is behind a better fence. The boy picks figs only after paying for them. The praetor's clerk files one more page in a city that stays calm because anger can invoice. You pass a wall that once dropped plaster on a tenant. Section 10 ceiling still rehabilitating, now plastered with a fresh notice. Owner liable for what falls, by order of the aediles. Commerce smiles. Sleep considers returning. You go home thinking of how Roman law domesticates outrage. Classify, select action, measure loss, add penalty where useful. Let no harm slip out the side door because no one knew the right word. Action by action, the city trades vengeance for valuation. It's not mercy exactly. It's discipline with a calculator and a sense of humor. You pour a little wine for the Laras and promise to keep your jars nearer the wall, your geese less ambitious, and your neighbor's dignity on budget. You wake to a house that runs on titles rather than coffee. Everyone belongs to someone, a father with patria potestas, children under his legal shadow, a wife either inside that shadow by old ritual or standing alongside it by newer habit, and a tangle of tutors and curators ready to sign where custom says pens must pause. Roman private law starts at the front door, first the family, then the forum. Begin with the tripod of status. Status libertatis, free or slave, status civitatis, citizen or not, status familiae, in whose power you live. For citizens, that last one explains why a gray-haired senator and his bearded, competent, 40-year-old son can both stand in court as sons in power. Filiae familias, until the pater familias dies or frees them. Mainstream fact, patria potestas is persistent and technical. It lasts to a child's adulthood, marriage, and magistracies, and ends only by the father's death or emancipation, the old triple sale ritual for sons, a lighter path for daughters, or by the child's adoption into another potestas. The Roman state may ask you to command legions. Your father may still sign your deed. Marriage fits in two sockets. Anciently there is cum manu, the wife, in the hand of her husband, joining his agnatic line by solemnity, conferiatio, coentio, or a year's usus without the famous trinoxium getaway. But by your era, sign manu is the norm. Spouses share a bed in a household, not a legal person. She remains under her father if he lives, or else sui juris with the tutor. Property follows the socket. In sign manu, her non-dot goods remain hers. The husband gets management of the dose, dowry, for the burdens of marriage and must return it on divorce with only narrow deductions. Your Section 13 ledger on divorce still smirks at how specific those deductions can be. Consent makes the bond, hers, his, and their guardians if they're under power, plus connubium, capacity to marry. The city cares about age, puberty benchmarks, kinship lines, no marrying your closest, and existing knots, no bigamy in polite company. Ceremony can be simple. Witnesses, gifts, and a steady door are the essentials. Light joke 1. A poet says love needs only 2 hearts. The jurist says it also needs 2 signatures and a calendar that remembers deadlines. Children arrive into potestas like sun into a courtyard. Naming day, dies lustricus, gives a boy his bulla and a girl her charms. Legitimacy follows the bedding, born to spouses with connubium and a timeline that keeps arithmetic plausible. Illegitimate children, naturals, exist, loved and fed. Their inheritance rights grow in later centuries, but in your classical moment usually need a will's kindness. Adoption solves dynastic puzzles with tidy rope work. Adoptio moves a child from one father's potestas to another's, usually after emancipation. Aggregatio transfers an entire sui juris person, with his own household, under a new potestas, traditionally with pontifical oversight because gods and ledgers both dislike sudden family mergers. Historians still argue whether aggregatio in the Republic primarily served religious ends, maintaining ancestral rights, or economic ones, keeping estates intact. The paperwork smiles and says, both. Potestas once carried grim classical prerogatives you'd rather file under museum. The ancient ius vitae nascisque, life and death power, recedes into taboo long before your morning. Jurists and emperors fence it with penalties and publicity until it lives only in moralists' footnotes. What survives robustly is control over a child in power's property. Enter peculium, that little estate a father lets a son, or master lets a slave, manage. Everyday peculium remains the pater's. But Augustus blesses peculium castrans, military earnings, as the sons own to will freely. Later, quasi-castrants extends similar independence to imperial service and certain professional earnings. The law discovers that adulthood sometimes begins at the paymaster. Women's sui juris meet the figure who has launched 1,000 seminars, the tutor mulieris. In classical doctrine, an adult woman not under potestas requires a tutor's auctoritas for certain acts, especially alienating land or making a will. In practice, the tutor is often a formality, a friendly agnate, a testamentary appointee, or a magistrate's nominee who rarely obstructs and frequently signs on cue. Gaius' notorious line about women's lightness of mind deserves an eye roll audible from here. Documents show canny businesswomen using tutors like wax seals. Over time, statutory and administrative shortcuts, guardian by will, by magistrate, or dispensations, turn tutela into a polite ritual, not a leash. Light joke 2. A banker refuses to honor a woman's order without her tutor. She returns with a tutor and a better rate. The banker discovers belief. For minors and the vulnerable, guardianship divides like careful grammar. Tutela belongs to impubers, prepubescent children, guardians managing property and giving consent for acts that need adult hands. Cura assists puberes with specific needs, cura minorum for those just past puberty but under 25 who may undo improvident bargains by restitutio in integrum, cura furiosi for the mentally ill, cura prodigii for spendthrifts judicially restrained from dissolving estates into poetry. Guardians can be testamentarii, named in a will, legitimi, agnatic kin by law, or dativi, appointed by a magistrate. They owe accounts, rations rhetera, can be sued for mismanagement, actio tuteli, and resign reputations if they forget that children are not purses. Inheritance patterns betray earlier agnatic logics slowly giving way to closer affections. The old civil scheme privileged agnates. The praetor's bonorum possessio invites emancipated children and cognates into the house. Later senatorial decrees, SC Tertullianum and SC Orficianum, improve succession between mothers and children. Wills, of course, orchestrate most estates. Disinheriting children requires pointed clauses. The law makes cruelty expensive. Dowries travel in and must travel out. Husbands counter gifts. Donatio ante nuptias, later propter nuptias, float in the background as a fledgling idea that will mature much later. You hear Section 15's widow nodding from the future. Sons in power sign contracts that the law regards with paternal filters. Strictly, a filius familius cannot bind the pater unless armed with a peculium label or shop sign that the praetor respects, hence actio de peculio, quod iussu, institutoria, reach the father or principal when the son or manager contracts in the business. Torts invite noxal actions with the father's choice, pay damages or surrender the wrongdoer. A Roman relic usually redeemed by coin because decent houses prefer payments to pageants. The line between family and firm is a bookkeeping exercise. Jurists supply the columns. Slavery's shadow falls here in status arithmetic. Enslaved persons stand outside citizen status. Manumission, curbed and channeled by the Augustan Lex Aelia Sentia and Lex Fufia Caninia, creates freedmen and freedwomen with patronal ties, civic rights, and limits that melt in the next generation. Households therefore contain all three statuses, freeborn, freed, enslaved, under one roof, with law allocating roles and remedies. Your Section 14 already walked those corridors by lamplight. Augustan marriage laws glide in with policy and propaganda. Lex Iulia de Maritandis Ordinibus and Lex Papia Papia nudge elites toward marrying and producing children with incentives. Ius Liberorum loosening guardianship and gift restrictions, and penalties for obstinate bachelorhood. Adultery sails from family scandal into public crime under the Lex Iulia de Adulteriis. You met its chill in Section 13. Historians still argue whether these moral laws changed behavior or changed paperwork. Inscriptions show eager compliance on stones. Widows boasting ius liberorum, while poets suggest the city did what cities do and learned to write better excuses. Quirky tidbit: the household shrine, Lararium, sometimes displays tiny wax masks of ancestors, imagines, next to a boy's bulla hung up when he assumes the toga virilis. Legal milestones as interior decor. Another, on Emancipation Day, some families sell a son 3 times to a friend and manumit him back, smiling through the antique pantomime because the 12 tables still haunt the script. Guardianship practice hums with oversight. A tutor who delays consent unreasonably can be replaced. A curator who invests in imaginary ships earns a lawsuit and perhaps a public reputation that clears theaters. Magistrates keep short lists of eligible guardians and long memories for those who treat wards as harvesting grounds. Light joke 3. A tutor lectures a ward on thrift while wearing 18 rings. The judge suggests the ward start thrift by selling one of them. Daily life puts doctrine to work gently. A mother sui juris arranges a daughter's sign manu marriage, inserts a sensible dowry clause about roof leaks, names a friendly tutor by will, and files the tablets where even the cat can't knock them. A father emancipates an industrious son so the boy can make a testament after campaign, peculium castrans already his, and then adopts him back as heir by will, language that would make a modern tax planner weep with admiration. A grandfather appoints curators in advance for teenage grandsons whose courage exceeds arithmetic. The law does not hover, it posts directions. Mainstream anchor to button the cloak, Gaius, 1-2, maps patria potestas, marriage forms, tutela and cura. Jurists and senatorial decrees reshape inheritance between mothers and children. Augustan statutes regulate manumission and marriage. Later constitutions relax tutela mulierum's teeth. The Justinianic compilers will rationalize all this into textbook order. But the classical furniture you're touching is the real room. Historians still argue whether Roman family law was a cage or a scaffold. Did potestas and tutela confine agency? Or did practice and praetorian equity turn them into frameworks within which households improvise freedom? The evidence points to both: harsh powers tamed by custom, formal guardians who learned to sign and step aside, children who became adults in the eyes of paymasters before fathers, and women who steered estates through tutors the way sailors steer through fog. By horn and habit. By dusk, your house feels legible. Who can consent? Who must countersign? Which property sleeps under which name? And where the ladder is if a minor climbs too high. You set a little lamp at the Lararium, hang the bully you took off the boy this morning, and smile at the tablet where a tutor's neat octoritas sits under a woman's very decisive signature. Tomorrow, you'll walk outside to the provinces where Rome lets local law braid with its own. Section 13's map is already open. For tonight, the city's private constitution closes like a well-balanced ledger. You step off a dusty road into a governor's forum that smells like olive mash and compromise. The signboard lists tomorrow's hours in Latin. The market speaks 4 languages at once. A priest in linen carries a city's memory in a basket. Roman law lives here, but it breathes through local noses. Your job, if you want your cargo released before the figs ferment, is to let 2 systems braid without tearing. Start with the furniture, a provincial governor, proconsul or propraetor in senatorial provinces, legate or procurator in imperial ones, posts an edict on arrival. It is cousin to the city praetor's album, but customized for the province's arteries, court days, guarantees for travelers, tariffs for ferries, how to sue an absent shipowner who is always coming next week. Mainstream fact to plant like a milestone. Governors issued provincial edicts that adapted the urban edicts' remedies, interdicts, actions boni fidei, bonorum possessio, to local conditions. Inscriptions and papyri preserve clauses about interest ceilings, pledge rules, and deadlines, showing a living hybrid rather than a transplanted marble. Local law is not a guest, it's a co-host. Greek polis keep their civic codes and councils. Egyptian villages keep demotic contracts and temple calendars. Jewish communities keep marriage and inheritance norms inside halakhic fences. Punic cities keep weights that remember Carthage. The Roman rule of thumb is tolerant geometry. What does not collide with sovereignty, taxes, or peace may continue. So the city's high priest still chooses festival days, the town council still leases fish ponds, and the village still writes dowry deeds in its own phrases, so long as Rome can read the total on the tax tablet and nobody raises private armies. You feel the governor's edict translating, not erasing. A Greek sale deed has narrative clauses, quantity, quality, delivery, before the west wind changes. But the Roman judge pins a boni fidei action to it so that an argument about bad wine becomes a remedy instead of a song. A Jewish ketubah, marriage settlement, lists the bride's protections. If a dispute crosses into the Roman court, the governor enforces the economic promises while politely refusing to arbitrate theology. A village council fine for trampling sacred groves stands. A council fine for insulting a magistrate's cousin does not. Light joke 1. The governor says local custom is welcome, unless it collects taxes twice. The tax office says local custom is suspicious, unless it collects taxes twice. The map of persons, too, is layered. A peregrine, non-citizen, sues under the praetor peregrinus's grammar, contracts judged by good faith, possession protected by interdicts, deposits returned without philosophical delays. A citizen sues with stricter civil bones. A mixed marriage may have no connubium, yet the children's status and property expectations can be protected by praetorian equity and provincial habit. When in doubt, the governor asks the city council how they would have judged the same dispute last winter, and then adds a Latin reason about peace. Land tenure is the province's favorite headache. Technically, conquered provincial soil belongs to the Roman people or the emperor. Locals hold at Rome's pleasure and pay tributum. Practically, families plow, inherit, and mortgage like everyone else. To stabilize, the system grows longe temporis prescriptio, hold land openly for 10 years with both parties present, or 20 if someone is absent, and the possessor gains a defense even against the citizen with a very photogenic title scroll. Over longer centuries, longissimi temporis, 30, 40 years, hushes ancient injustices whose witnesses now speak only in moss. The message is therapeutic: plant vines, pay tax, sleep. Historians still argue whether Rome consciously aimed at legal pluralism as policy or merely tolerated local law out of administrative laziness gilded as wisdom. One camp sees a strategy of controlled diversity that minimized resistance and court load. Another sees a patchwork that governors stitched anew each term. The papyri and inscriptions tempt both readings. Meticulous dockets beside improvised kindness. Walk into a village archive in Egypt, and you'll see the hybrid in ink. A Greek syngraphy, IOU, cites a Roman-style stipulatio line to make a judge smile. A lease warns of penalties. According to the edict, the governors, not Plato's, distributes fields among sons and daughters according to local custom, then appends a Roman witness clause to travel well. Mainstream papyrological habit. Scribes often doubled formulas, Greek narrative plus Latin skeleton, to satisfy both temple and tribunal. The result is bilingual sanity where cargo moves instead of letters. Cities, jealous and practical, memorialize their deals with Rome in bronze. A charter, lex colonii or lex municipi, lists institutions, courts, and privileges, how many aediles, which festivals get public funds, where to post edicts, how to select jurors. Colonial towns in Spain or Gaul sport near-Roman constitutions with local furniture. Federate Greek cities keep a proud slice of autonomy while acknowledging Roman jurisdiction in crimes against the state and disputes above their pay grade. Inscriptions brag about concordia, a word that means both harmony and "we signed a useful treaty." Criminal justice tilts more Roman as stakes rise. Local councils handle market brawls and boundary tantrums. Governors claim homicide, banditry, tax evasion, and anything that smells like sedition. Trials follow cognitio, petitions, witnesses, reasons written, appeals possible. Local oaths may be respected. Swear by Sarapis if that's your god. But the sentence reads in Latin even when the tears don't. Light joke 2. A town asks to punish a thief. According to ancestral custom, the governor replies, "Excellent, our ancestors now require receipts." Revenue disciplines the dance. Censuses count heads and vines. Portoria tax goods at bridges and ports. Vectigalia lease public revenues to contractors who can be either efficient or legend. Nothing kills, local custom, faster than a clever attempt to rename taxes as sacrifices. Nothing earns favor faster than a city that paves roads without creative bookkeeping. Governors publish maximum interest rates, grain price interventions in scarcity, and rules for pledges so that credit circulates without turning into theatrical tragedy. Quirky tidbit. Some provinces posted bilingual courtroom timetables on stone, Greek for the people, Latin for the file, complete with a carved hand pointing toward the basilica. Another, in rough districts, edicts threaten fines for carrying swords in town and very specifically, for bringing camels onto pavements during market hours. Legal anthropology meets hoofprint. Religion, ever the negotiator, gets treaties of its own. The imperial cult coexists with local gods. Priests of Rome and Augustus occupy a dais beside priests of Athena or Isis. Festivals blend garlands cleverly. As long as sacrifices don't incite riots and processions don't block tax wagons, the governor's smile is wide. When conscience meets command, say, refusing imperial rights, the tone shifts to imperial law. Historians still argue whether governors pursued uniform repression or case-by-case management. Letters of Pliny and rescripts of Trajan suggest a cautious, administrative approach rather than zeal, but later centuries write in bolder inks. Cities litigate against cities like cousins with long memories. Boundary stones walk at night. River rights multiply each drought. Theater seating, yes, theater seating, can spark lawsuits that outlive actors. The governor orders surveys, hears inscriptions read with pride, and issues a decision that tries to save everyone's face. If the loser sulks, appeal climbs to the legatus Augusti, the prefect, or even the emperor. Rescripts return with tight Latin and wider consequences. Citizenship spreads as a legal solvent. Individual grants for service, collective grants for loyal towns, and finally Caracalla's Constitutio Antoniniana, 212 c, extends citizenship broadly to freed provincials, harmonizing private law status across the map. Mainstream fact: after 212, most free inhabitants of the empire count as Roman citizens, which accelerates the blending of ius civil and ius gentium. Local public law remains, but private disputes increasingly wear Roman shoes. Light joke 3. A village elder says, "We are all Romans now." The tax collector replies, "I always knew." Commerce, meanwhile, runs on predictability. Governors standardize measures, police false weights, and bless guild bylaws that make bakers' hours regular and flour less philosophical. Letters of credit pass from Antioch to Massilia because courts at both ends recognize signatures and habit. The more frequently a rule is posted on a wall, the less frequently someone has to shout at a dock. Not everything harmonizes. Custom says daughters inherit nothing, the praetor's order says otherwise. A compromise gives dowries that behave like inheritances in disguise. Custom says oath by deity n equals proof. The governor says, "Add 2 witnesses." Custom says, "We always fine for that." The edict says, "You always will, but in my tariff." The trick is letting pride live while procedure works. Historians still argue whether Romanization was a cultural flood or a legal trickle. Did law change hearts or merely habits? Archaeology shows Latin graffiti beside local gods. Papyri show Roman clauses beside Greek rhetoric. Coins show emperors on one side and city goddesses on the other. The prudent conclusion: people kept their songs, learned new stamps, and appreciated roads. By dusk, you've watched a dyer from Tyre win a price reduction suit against a mountain town's wool guild. The governor loved his receipts. A Jewish widow recover her ketubah in a Roman action with a Hebrew inventory attached, and a Greek city lose a boundary quarrel but gain a bridge as consolation. You've learned to bring 2 copies of everything and a basket of figs for the clerk who schedules you before the camel cases. Mainstream anchor to close the ledger. Provincial edicts and local charters. From Spain's Lex Ernitana to Asia Minor's city decrees, papyri from Roman Egypt, and juristic discussions of longa temporis prescript show document how Rome blended its remedies with indigenous norms. Governors judged by cognitio, preserved records, and wrote reasons that later codes collect. The empire did not export a single code, it exported a habit: post rules, keep files, honor promises, count beans, and let local law sing unless it shouts. You leave the forum as lamps are lit. A boy practices Latin numbers next to Greek letters on a shop shutter. A magistrate's usher chalks tomorrow's docket in 2 scripts. A temple bell and a town bell ring almost together. Rome's genius here is not conquest but coherence. 1,000 customs fastened to one spine. Tomorrow, in section 14, Justinian will gather centuries into a bookshelf. Tonight, the province has taught you how law travels, by translation, tariffs, and the polite art of letting neighbors be themselves under a shared sky. You wake in a city where law puts on a crown and a bookshelf at the same time. Constantinople, domes, gulls, and clerks, is about to do something Romans had been threatening to do for centuries. Take the mountain of statutes, edicts, opinions, rescripts, and classroom notes you've been climbing and turn it into a staircase you can actually use. The emperor is Justinian. The librarian-in-chief is Tribonian. The project name is a mouthful that will outlive empires. Corpus Juris Civilis. Mainstream pegged to set the spine. Between 529 and 534 C, Justinian issues 3 pillars, and later a 4th. First, a codex, a collection of imperial constitutions from Hadrian onward, cleaned, consolidated, and made current. Second, the digest or pandex, 533, 50 books excerpting the classical jurists, chiefly Ulpian, Paul, Papinian, Gaius, and Modestinus, woven into a coherent doctrine. Third, the institutes, also 533, a teaching manual and 4 books for beginners, officially endowed with the force of law. Fourth, after 534, the Novelli constitutions, new laws, novels, in mostly Greek, issued as problems kept appearing like spirited weeds. One bookshelf for volumes, the promise that Rome's sentences will no longer be stored in pockets and legends. You can hear the editorial room hum. Tribonian, a legal polymath with a talent for both prose and politics, leads a commission of professors and judges. Their brief is both audacious and domestic. Take 3 million lines of juristic writing, keep the useful ones, reconcile contradictions, prune redundancies, bring procedure up to date, and make it read as if it were always meant to be so. It's a gardener's assignment with imperial deadlines. Light joke 1. A clerk asks whether they will finish soon. Tribonian answers, so soon that history will think it took us centuries. The Codex comes first in 529, soon revised in 534. Think of it as the imperial section, rescripts and constitutions sorted by topic, church matters, private law, criminal provisions, administration. Earlier codes, Gregorianus, Hermogenianus, Theodosianus, had tried. Justinian wants one authoritative text, newly edited, contradictions removed, obsolete rules buried with decent inscriptions. A preface declares that any law not in the code or later novels is not law. You feel the pen slapping the table. Cite this, not your grandfather. Then the digest, the crown jewel. 50 books, thousands of fragments, each with a little tag naming the jurist and source. Ulpian dominates. Paul speaks often. Papinian's sentences glow like moral anchors. Gaius supplies clarity. Modestinus closes the classical choir. The editors splice, paraphrase, and this is where scholars lift eyebrows, interpolate. Procedure has shifted from formulas, your sections 5 to 6, to cognitio, section 7. Inheritance rules have evolved. Criminal penalties have a Christian empire's tone. To keep doctrine coherent, words are adjusted. Historians still argue whether particular lines are faithful quotations or 5th century updates wearing classical cloaks. Interpolation hunting became a sport in modern seminars. Spot the anachronism, win a footnote. The safe truth. The digest is a classical symphony arranged for a new orchestra and a larger hall. The institutes arrive as a lullaby for beginners with legal force. Modeled on Gaius institutes, they teach persons, things, and actions in tidy paragraphs, status and guardianship, property and iusacapio, contracts and delicts. They quote the digest and wink at the codex. They tell students not only what the law was but what it now is. For the first time, the emperor hands newcomers a miniature constitution of private law they can memorize without also memorizing goat-related exceptions. Light joke 2. A student asks whether he must learn every novel. The professor says, only the ones that arrive before the exam. They always arrive before the exam. The novels keep the system honest by admitting that life refuses to stop. Many are in Greek, the empire's working language in the East. They address church disputes, municipal burdens, marriage and dowry fine-tuning, guardianship refinements, and the ever-frisky subject of donations and wills. They also showed Justinian's personality, moral earnestness, administrative ambition, an occasional zest for centralization that makes provincial councils sigh and keep better minutes. Quirky tidbit. The digest's official release was celebrated like a new aqueduct. Scribes produced handsome copies. Law schools in Berytus and Constantinople swapped their old reading lists for the emperor's anthology. A few professors wrote study aids so rapidly that classmates alleged the drafts had been circulating under the table weeks in advance. Another, Justinian's prefaces read like imperial pep talks. Law as piety, justice as empire's backbone, codification as an act of mercy and tidiness. The compilation is not only a library, it's an eraser and a pen. By declaring the digest and institutes to have legal force, Justinian makes juristic scholarship, once persuasive opinion, into enacted law. He also abolishes citation wars. The old law of citations, privileging 5 jurists, matter less when the emperor chooses the quotations himself. Judges now cite Digest 9.2 instead of Ulpian in the 43rd book, if your copy hasn't lost a leaf. Merchants can finally carry smaller briefcases. Historians still argue whether the project froze law into a museum or equipped practice with a sharper tool. Critics say codification ossifies. Admirers reply that Justinian's team also pruned, unified, and then kept legislating via novels. The late antique courts, running on cognitio, benefited from having one shelf to consult instead of chasing papyrus ghosts. The truth you can feel in dockets. Cases moved, reasons could be copied, appeals could cite the same page numbers at both ends of the road. The compilation also translates Rome into Christendom. The codex and novels echo Christian ethics, on marriage impediments, charity, bishops' roles, manumission in churches, while the digest keeps the secular grammar you've learned, bona fides, dolus, culpa, usucapio, interdicts, servitudes. The result is not pious fog. It is a legal climate where old remedies breathe in new air. A dowry still returns, a will still needs witnesses, a thief still pays multiples, but bishops now have standing, monasteries hold property, and Sunday gets legal protection that even geese can't ignore. Administration meets pedagogy. Law schools teach from the institutes and digest. Advocates quote them. Judges write them into reasons. Notaries embed their phrases into contracts that travel astonishing distances. Provincial courts, used to improvisation, Section 13's hybrid, now pin decisions to canonize fragments. When disputes cross languages, Greek epitomes of the digest and novels help. When scribes grow lazy, penalties spark. When local habit resists, a citation disarms objection. Light joke 3. A village headman says, "We always did it this way." The judge replies, "You always did it that way until page 12. The legacy you're watching is twofold, a canon and a method. The canon, the corpus, will wander through Byzantine centuries, get summarized by medieval Greek compilers, and survive falls that crush armies. The method, compile, harmonize, teach, will inspire the medieval revival in Bologna, glossators covering margins with disciplined graffiti, then civilian systems across Europe, then the great codes, Prussian, Austrian, French. When the Code Napoleon speaks of property, obligations, and delicts, you can hear digest vocabulary slowed into French. When modern textbooks divide persons, things, actions, they are still turning Gaius pages under Justinian's lamp. Historians still argue whether Tribonian's editing corrupted the classics with Christian and late antique sensibilities or wisely shaved barbs to fit new procedure. Some lines in the digest do look suspiciously modern for Ulpian. Some contradictions dissolve in ways too elegant to be accidental. But the lived effect in Justinian's courts was rationalization, not vandalism. A judge no longer had to choose between 3 incompatible Ulpians. The emperor had done the choosing in advance. The compilation also closes circles opened in our earlier sections. The actions world, sections 5 to 6, is preserved as doctrine even as cognitio rules the floor, section 7. The jurist voices, section 8, are canonized, with their quarrels curated. Property and possession, section 9, are taught with classical clarity but enforced by administrative courts. Contracts, section 10, and delicts, section 11, get their clean taxonomies, so that merchants and goat owners alike can find themselves in the index. Family and guardianship, section 12, receive tidy chapters that make tutors easier to scold and dowries easier to return. The provinces, section 13, get a citation language that travels better than accents. Mainstream anchor to close your notebook. Justinian's first code, 529, replaced earlier codes. The digest and institutes were promulgated in 533. A second code, 534, updated the constitutions after the digest. The novels continued thereafter, mostly in Greek. These works, rediscovered and taught in the medieval West, became the backbone of the Ius commune. Whether or not every line is pure, classical Roman law matters less to practice than the fact that whole continents learn to think in its categories. By night, the scriptorium's lamps flicker, and you realize a legal civilization has done something astonishingly humane. It has taken chaos, curated it, admitted its edits, and given students a map. Tomorrow, in Section 15, you'll watch that map unroll across the Middle Ages to modern codes. But tonight, enjoy the quiet boast of one imperial memory. We wrote it down, we organized it, and we taught it to people who were not born yet. Somewhere, a copyist sands a sheet. Somewhere, a judge turns to Digest 9 and finds exactly the sentence he needs. Somewhere, a student falls asleep on the institutes and dreams of bona fides behaving like a lullaby. You open a vellum manuscript and watch Rome wake up with a medieval accent. The empire's western furniture is splintered. The sentences survive in trunks and memory. In Italy, notaries keep formulas breathing. In Gaul, church courts cradle inheritance and marriage. In the East, Byzantium keeps Justinian's bookshelf dusted. Then, like someone lighting a lamp in a long hallway, students in Bologna start reading the digest aloud, and the room fills with gloss. Mainstream anchored to set the bench, around the late 11th and early 12th centuries, Irnerius and his successors in Bologna revived systematic study of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. They write glossy, marginal notes on problematic words and harmonize contradictions by ingenious cross-references. Their heirs, the glossators, Accursius, the famous editor, produced the Glossa Ordinaria, a standard running commentary. The next wave, the commentators, Bartolus, Baldus, stretched Roman categories over medieval city-state puzzles, river rights, confederations, mercantile practice, adding practical public law sagas to private law's tidy rooms. You stand in a lecture hall where the professor chants a digest fragment, then the glossa, then his commentary, and the students copy like monks who learn to sprint. Law becomes a shared Latin across Europe. Ius commune, the common law of the learned, woven with canon law, church court's domain, into a two-voice melody that judges can hum in any city that posts court hours. Canonists polish marriage doctrines, consent makes marriage, impediments tie knots around knots, refine procedure, written proofs, appeals, and shape equity that will later whisper inside secular courts whenever conscience knocks. Historians still argue whether the medieval revival rediscovered a pristine Justinian or created a new Roman law by interpretation. The safe sentence is a duet. They revived the canon and invented a method, text, gloss, dialectic, that let judges breathe doctrine into new facts. The evidence is the docket, watermills sharing rivers, towns suing princes, merchants suing other merchants from other towns without first learning each other's saints. Quirky tidbit. Glossators drew tiny pointing hands, manicules, in margins next to killer lines. Some drew faces that looked suspiciously like their deans. Another, law students celebrated Digest Day by reciting favorite fragments in taverns, which is why a few manuscripts smell faintly of spiced wine and bravado. The Ius commune spreads on parchment and habit. Notaries in Italian communes build a documentary civilization. Wills, dowry charters, leases, with clauses half digest, half neighborhood. City statutes, statuta, sit beside Roman doctrine like house rules beside a manual. We adopt Roman rules except for bread weights and balcony drips. Judges use the glossa to interpret statutes. Statutes specify when to ignore the glossa. Practice stitches the seam tighter each year. Meanwhile, in the East, the Justinianic family spawns vernacular abridgments. The Basilica, 9th to 10th centuries, rework the corpus in Greek. Epitomes and peasant law books translate principles into farmer-safe sentences. The Byzantine habit of cognitio courts continues. Records, petitions, reasons. So when Ottoman and Balkan legal hybrids appear later, they carry Byzantine footnotes even when they stop saying Byzantine out loud. Light joke 1. A Bolognese student boasts he can cite 3 Ulpians before breakfast. The innkeeper replies he can serve 3 eggs without footnotes. Come early modernity. Europe starts collecting its own statutes like seashells. Reception of Roman law in German lands, the 15th to 16th centuries, turns the digest into default private law in many territories. The Gemians wrecked, except where local codes contradict. Universities train judges who think in Roman categories. Imperial courts, Reichskammergericht, speak digest with a Swabian accent. Spain's Siete Partidas blend Roman, canon, and royal law in a luminous Castilian. Portugal's Ordenacos do similar. Scotland quietly keeps a mixed civilian pedigree. The Low Countries become a legal herb garden that later seasons South African and Sri Lankan law. Historians still argue whether reception was a top-down imperial project or bottom-up professional convergence. Archival habits show both. Princes issued mandates. Courts preferred predictability. Merchants preferred judges who reached the same answers in Antwerp and Augsburg. The recipe included power, pedagogy, and the practical charisma of a good index. Then codes arrived like printed furniture. Prussia's Allgemeines Landrecht, 1794, attempts encyclopedic coverage down to door hinges. Austria's ABGB, 1811, offers elegant economy, persons, things, obligations, in prose a civil servant could love forever. France's Code Civil, 1804, distills Roman categories through Enlightenment and Revolution. Property as absolute but socially located, contract as consent plus cause, family reshaped, then reshaped again, by politics. Light joke 2. Napoleon allegedly quips that his true glory is not 40 battles but the code. A jurist replies. At last, a general who loves footnotes. The export list grows. The French code travels to Belgium, Italy, as a model then a foil, Spain, influence and debate, Latin America, with local heroics. Germany answers with science. The Bergerliches Gesetzbuch, BGB, 1900, systematizes obligations, property, family, succession in Pandectist architecture, Allgemeiner Teil, general part, up front then the rest, so tidy that later drafters bow before entering. Japan adopts a civil code influenced by the French, then German revisions. Switzerland crafts its own supple codes, CGB/OR, that teach judges to move between rule and equity like mountain goats. Turkey secularizes with Swiss models. Italy's 1942 code blends French brevity and German structure. Quebec's 1994 civil code sings in French to Canadian weather. Mainstream anchor. Modern civil codes, while national, largely preserve Roman DNA. Ownership/possession, prescription, times alchemy. Obligations by contract and delict, tort, unjust enrichment, family and succession structures, filtered through centuries of canon law, scholastic method, natural law, Grotius, Pufendorf, and codification politics. Read A Duty of Good Faith and Performance, and you're reading a bona fides with a fresh haircut. Read Acquisitive Prescription and you're hearing Eusecapio count years with a new calendar. Across the channel, the English common law keeps its separate drum, jury trials, writ system heritage, case law accretion, but borrows Roman and canon tools, equity's conscience, trust-like devices, restitution's elegant grammar, academic taxonomy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, comparative lawyers build bridges, sale of goods acts learned from Roman sale. Scholars like Maitland and Wigmore flirt with Roman method. Modern restitution in common law courts reads, at times, like a Roman condictio that lost its Latin but kept its wallet. Historians still argue whether codification clarifies or oversimplifies. Do codes freeze doctrine into slogans, or provide a clear starting point for judicial intelligence? The pragmatic verdict is continental. Codes begin sentences, courts finish them. Commentary and jurisprudence write footnotes that become veins under the code's skin. Quirky tidbit: 19th century German students carried Pandekton, civil law casebooks, so bulky that tailors added a lawyer's pleat to coats. Another, early editions of the Code Civil were printed pocket size for officers, who were expected to carry them literally into battle, which explains certain scuffed copies that smell of leather and rain. Modern supranational projects extend Rome's geometry. The UN Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, CISG, abstracts sale to a global grammar. European principles and draft common frames of reference read like ultra-nerdy digest fan fiction. Civilian systems continue to tune their codes. France's 2016 reform of obligations nods to good faith and hardship. Light joke 3. A committee debates whether to call it unjust enrichment or unwarranted enrichment. A student suggests, "Please give it back." And yet the essential Roman habit persists. Remedies before rhetoric, categories you can teach, time as a legal actor, good faith as a thermostat. You see delict morph into tort, stipulatio echo in consideration discussions, or penalty clauses, actio publiciana reincarnate as possessor protection and adverse possession, bonorum possessio reflected in modern succession fixes. When a court today weighs a landlord's duty for a collapsing ceiling or a seller's duty for hidden defects, a praetor's edict smiles from a very old shelf. Mainstream peg to close your scroll. From Bologna's gloss to Bartolus commentaries, from the Ius Commune to national codifications, Prussia, Austria, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Japan, Turkey, Quebec, Roman law's categories traveled, blended with canon law and local statutes, and hardened into the architectures of modern private law. Whether courts cite Ulpian by name or by reflex, the logic survives. Historians still argue whether the Roman legacy is best imagined as a river, continuous flow, a canal, engineered and redirected, or an aqueduct, old arches carrying new water. You can enjoy the metaphor and still notice the practical continuity. People still buy, lease, injure, inherit, promise, default, apologize, and appeal. The labels changed fonts. The remedies stayed readable. You close the vellum and hear the modern city around you. Traffic, contracts, notice boards, appeals deadlines. If you listen closely, the words underneath the noise are Roman, arranged by medieval pens, printed by modern presses, and spoken by clerks who have learned to say bona fides with local vowels. The legacy isn't a museum. It's a habit of mind you can use tomorrow when a neighbor's tree leans over your fence, and you want a remedy that pays for a saw and keeps the peace. Let the room dim, and let the vocabulary loosen into something softer than marble. You've walked from unwritten custom to bronze tables, from praetors' yearly menus to emperors' anthologies, from jurists' neat sentences to codes that fit in a pocket. Now the noise recedes to a steady hush, the kind a city makes when it trusts its own habits, and you can lie back and let the categories fade into shapes. Property becomes the weight of a key in your palm, warm and certain. Contract becomes a simple promise spoken once, cleanly, and kept. Delict becomes the apology that arrives on time with enough coin to mend what cracked. Family becomes the lantern at a doorway and the names spoken softly around it. Procedure becomes a path you can walk at night without stumbling. Good faith becomes the temperature of the room, just right, not noticed because it fits your skin. If a page of Latin still flickers behind your eyes, don't fight it. Watch the letters drift like embers and settle. The forum's chalk docket wipes itself clean. The governor's clerk caps his ink. The copyist hands a page and closes the wooden boards with a whisper. A lictor lowers the fasces to no one in particular, out of courtesy. Somewhere, a jurist folds a letter that answers a question you haven't thought to ask yet, and the answer is calmer than the question. Breathe in, a hint of vellum and lamp oil. Breathe out, the sense that rules are simply agreed kindnesses written down carefully. Each breath a lull, each exhale a small acquittal. Let the Roman habit do what it has always done for tired neighbors. Make tomorrow legible, so tonight can be quiet. The lamp at the Lararium is a tiny moon. The city's roofs are a gentle tide. And the law, for once, is not a lecture but a lullaby that promises only this: sleep now, we'll count the days for you.